Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we explore the wild things that were cut from Skyrim. Content so strange, so fully formed, and so hauntingly close to making it into the final game that you'll wonder how you never noticed the gaps they left behind. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next. And subscribe if this helps you sleep. The Windhelm arena that almost changed everything. Deep beneath the grey stone streets of Windhelm, buried in the game's files like a forgotten tomb, lies one of the most substantial pieces of cut content in all of Skyrim. A fully realised underground arena known as the Pit. This wasn't a vague design document or a half-written idea scrawled in the margins of a meeting. The Pit had named NPCs, voiced dialogue, a dedicated quest line, a system of fighters and wagers, and even a unique method of getting there. If you were arrested in Eastmarch and thrown into Windhelm's jail, you were never meant to simply wait out your sentence. You were meant to fight for your freedom. A jailkeeper named Hookie Seven Swords would intercept you the moment you picked the lock on your cell, greeting you with a line that still exists in the game's audio files today. We don't just let people rot in cells until they've served their time. Here, you fight. If you win, you go free. If you lose, well, you'll know the freedom of Sovngarde if you're lucky. The Pit had fan spectators, a wager manager named Benkum, who casually accepted bribes, and multiple fighters with full personality traits and complex relationships among each other. All of them were cut. And yet, in the final game, when you arrest or confront characters in Windhelm's prison, an NPC still refers to that area as the Bloodworks, the arena term, as if the ghost of the Pit is still breathing under the stone. The Dark Brotherhood wanted you to kill a friend. Before Skyrim shipped, Bethesda's pre-release press materials described the Dark Brotherhood questline with a detail that was ultimately scrapped. When you joined the guild, you wouldn't be asked to kill strangers. You'd be asked to kill someone you had personally befriended over the course of your playthrough. The idea was deeply unsettling in the best way. The Brotherhood would track your relationships across the world and demand that intimacy be weaponized. The remnants of this concept are still woven into the game's files. There is an unused NPC, listed plainly in the creation kit as player friend, who is directly tied to the quest with friends like these. His only purpose, according to the data, was to be someone you cared about, and then to die. Even Astrid's dialogue was different. In the cut version, she wouldn't tell you to kill one of 3 anonymous prisoners. She would say quietly and without ceremony, "Kill a friend, then sleep and I'll visit you once more." The decision to soften this into the 3 strangers scenario, from the final game makes the Brotherhood questline feel almost gentle by comparison. Somewhere in Bethesda's development process, someone decided the world wasn't ready for that particular cruelty, and they may have been right. Boethia wanted you to assassinate Jarl Elisif. Boethia's calling is one of the darker quests in the base game. You lure a trusted follower to a shrine and sacrifice them. But the quest was designed to have a second chapter that never made it to release. After completing Boethia's calling and equipping the Ebony Mail, the Daedric Prince was supposed to appear and issue a new command. Travel to Solitude and assassinate Jarl Elisif the Fair using stealth, deceit, and guile. This second quest is called Boethia's Bidding in the files, and its opening dialogue is fully voiced. Boethia would say, "You have earned the right to call yourself my champion, and now you must perform the task for which I created you. Go to Solitude, stalk the Jarl and slay her. Her death wouldn't be the end of it. The quest data reveals that Erica, Solitude's opportunistic merchant noble, was lined up to replace Elisif as Jarl upon her death, and had dialogue prepared for that role. Boethia would then speak through Elisif's corpse, delivering lines almost identical to those at the end of her quest in its current form. There are leftover stage conditions from when this quest was active. Upon entering the Blue Palace, a guard would have stopped you, and Boethia herself would have spread rumors of an assassin in advance, placing the palace on high alert and making your approach more difficult. Killing a major Civil War quest giver had enormous implications for the game's branching narrative, and at some point, someone chose the cleaner path and removed it entirely. But the bones of that darker story are still there, fully voiced, just under the surface, waiting. The missing apprentices. Walk far enough into the frozen wilderness around Winterhold, and you'll find them. 4 dead college students scattered across the ice and tundra, each carrying a unique item and a story that the game never tells you. Borvir and Rundi were twin brothers who were obsessed with mead, convinced they could use frost magic to chill their brew and compete with Honningbrew meadery. Iliste had been experimenting with illusion magic on skeevers. Yzra had been testing improvements to flame cloak spells in Arctic conditions. Finis Gestor, the conjuration master at the college, will actually mention all 4 of them by name if you speak to him. A conversation designed to send you out into the world to find what happened. When you bring back their unique items, he even has final lines prepared. Well, all of the previous apprentices have been accounted for, thanks to you. Here, why don't you take this? But the reward never triggers. The quest never formally starts. The corpses are there. The dialogue is there. The unique daggers and necklaces are there. Everything exists except the invisible thread that would tie it all together. It stands as one of Skyrim's most hauntingly incomplete stories. 4 young mages who died pursuing their research, with a teacher who mourns them and a player who can only watch. Frost River Farm and the mead delivery quest. Borvir and Rundi's story doesn't end with the missing apprentices quest. In an earlier version of Skyrim's development, those same brothers weren't dead at all. They were alive, operating a popular meadery called Frost River Farm near Winterhold, and they needed your help making deliveries. The quest, called Supply Line, would have sent you to Candlehearth Hall in Windhelm, the Frozen Hearth in Winterhold, or the Bannered Mare in Whiterun, delivering their famous Frost River mead for a reward of 50 gold. It was a repeatable task, a gentle errand that would bring you through familiar inns, see you, speak to innkeepers you already knew, and make Skyrim feel like a place with an actual economy. The voiced dialogue for every innkeeper target still exists. Rundi himself still has dialogue tied to the quest, even though in the shipped game he appears only as a frozen corpse southeast of Winterhold, never having opened his meadery, never having made a single delivery. Both versions of his fate, the living brewer and the dead apprentice, exist in the game simultaneously. 2 histories layered over the same body, neither one complete. Goldar the Giant and the Civil War's wild missing mission. Of all the Civil War missions that were cut before release, the one that would have been most remarkable involved a giant named Goldar. According to the remains of the quest CW mission 08, your commander would have sent you to deal with a giant who was harassing the army's supply caravans. The solution wasn't combat. You were supposed to acquire a painted cow, feed it an apple, coax it to follow you across the countryside, and then present it to Goldar as a peace offering. At which point, the giant would not only stop attacking your caravans, but would become your ally. And it didn't stop there. According to the quest's CW Allies data, Goldar and his newly forged alliance with the Dragonborn could have shown up in siege battles, a 20-foot giant lumbering into the fight for whichever side you had chosen. There is even an unused NPC in the files called Cowhand, who would have appeared near the painted cow to help facilitate the encounter. All of this, the cow, the giant, the diplomacy through livestock, was once a real quest in Skyrim's Civil War, and it is genuinely difficult to decide whether its removal made the game more or less interesting. The Windhelm Pit fighters, named and forgotten. The 5 NPCs designed for Windhelm's Cut Pit Arena weren't generic placeholder characters. They had names, personalities, relationships, and rivalries. Brond was a Nord fighter who carried an inexplicably powerful dragon plate shield alongside a steel greatsword and an imperial bow. An odd combination, considering Skyrim's engine doesn't actually allow a character to use a shield with a two-handed weapon. His relationships included a marked rivalry with a Dorfin, a wood elf archer who slept during the day and trained during the night, and the two were noted as foes of Liesel, a female fighter whose full story we can only guess at from the scraps of data left behind. Benkum managed the wagers and cheerfully implied in his dialogue that he was open to bribery. A character named the Fellow Prisoner was meant to be your first opponent, a randomly generated bandit who would have faced you in the sand while the crowd watched. All of them have full voice tracks. All of them have relationship webs and factions, and AI packages telling them exactly where to stand and when to sleep. They exist in complete detail in a city that, in the final game, has no idea they were ever planned. The Ghost Quest that never haunted anyone. In the files of Skyrim, labeled internally as WIKill02 and prefixed with the ominous developer note condition not to start, is a quest called Haunting. The premise was straightforward but strange. When a named NPC was killed by you, by an enemy, by any cause, there was a chance that their ghost would return and begin haunting their living family members. The ghost would linger for a set amount of time, following the bereaved relative through their daily life, appearing in doorways, standing at the edges of rooms, creating an ambient sadness that the world of Skyrim otherwise never quite achieves. There was even a companion quest called Mourning, with the same conditioned not to start flag, in which NPCs would enter a visible state of grief after losing a loved one, a mechanical acknowledgement that the people you killed had people who loved them. Neither quest ever triggered in the final game. Why both carry the same explicit developer flag rather than simply being incomplete is unclear. But the flag's phrasing suggests a deliberate decision to disable them, rather than a case of features simply left unfinished. Whatever the reason, performance, complexity, the sheer scope of tracking death states across hundreds of named NPCs, the world of Skyrim moves on without a ripple, which is perhaps less interesting than what Bethesda once imagined. Mike the Liar's secret room. Khajiit, traveling merchant caravans in Skyrim camp outside major cities. But they've always had a slightly ghostly quality, as if they materialize from nowhere and could vanish just as easily. Part of that quality comes from a room hidden inside the game's files, accessible only with console commands, named after the Khajiit homeland. Elsewhere, this tiny, windowless cell with no door and no entrance belongs to Mike the Liar, the wandering Khajiit, who appears across multiple Elder Scrolls games to offer cryptic commentary on the world. He doesn't live anywhere in the final game, he simply wanders. But the existence of this inaccessible room named after Khajiit territory adds a layer of strange mythology to his character. Is he from elsewhere? Does he simply claim the place as home because the name amuses him? The room has no contents. There is no quest attached to it. It is simply a private in-joke from a developer, or perhaps an unfinished idea that someone thought better of, sealed behind invisible walls and left to exist in a dimension the player can never quite reach. The Boethia cult had a second strike. How deep it went. It's worth dwelling on just how elaborately the Cut Boethia assassination quest had been developed. The palace mechanics went far beyond simply walking in and striking. Boethia would spread rumors of an approaching assassin before you even arrived, causing Elisif to lock herself in her private chambers out of paranoia. Placing the entire Blue Palace on high alert, if you approached her room, you'd find Falk Firebeard outside her door, and you could actually offer to serve as her bodyguard to get access. A friend inside the palace could also escort you past suspicious guards. Elisif herself, convinced an assassin was coming, had lines prepared. I'm glad they finally believed me. About the assassin, I mean. Well, at least I have you now. She was trusting you to protect her in a quest designed to end with you killing her. After the deed, Boethia would possess Elisif's corpse to speak, and the consequences rippled outward through the entire game's political structure in ways that were fully scripted. Guard dialogue was recorded for both Imperial and Stormcloak factions reacting to the news. Script notes reveal Erica would somehow have known it was the Dragonborn who did it, and Galmar Stonefist had lines prepared for the victory speech at Solitude, announcing that men had been sent to round up Erica. A Tursh single assassination and an entire political succession had been written out in full. The Civil War was supposed to reach every hold. The Civil War in the final game resolves itself in 3 locations: Whiterun, and then one of 2 final capitals depending on which side you chose. But the files tell a different story. Originally, siege battles were designed for every whole capital in Skyrim, not just the major ones. The smaller capitals, Winterhold, Dawnstar, Falkreath, and Morthal, would each have had their own unnamed troops and their own unnamed siege, ending when the defending force was wiped out. The larger capitals, Markarth and Riften, would have featured dramatic showdowns with the Jarls inside their own keeps, complete with written dialogue between each Jarl and their housecarl as you approached. There's even leftover dialogue from a scene inside Mistveil Keep, where Jarl Layla Lawgiver of Riften would have faced you with her housecarl at her side. Barricades, built into the architecture of every hold, capitals still exist in the final game. Placed during development, never activated, standing in doorways and alleys like stage props in a play that never ran. The developer even left a note in the CWS script, addressed to future modders, warning them that the Civil War code was full of obsolete stuff from previous iterations, where it was more dynamic and free form. An admission in the files themselves of how much was left behind. The Civil War was going to have Orc allies, alongside the Painted Cow mission and the giant named Goldar. The Civil War files include another cut mission that would have taken the conflict in a completely different direction. In a quest called CW Mission 11, you would have been sent on a spirit quest with an orc named Makal Abbas. The nature of this spirit quest is unclear from the remaining data, but its outcome was not. Completing it would have made you bloodkin to all orc strongholds in Skyrim, and Makel, Abbas himself, would have fought alongside you in civil war battles for the remainder of the campaign. The orc strongholds in the final game are already the most insular and self-contained communities in Skyrim. They want nothing from outsiders and ask little of them except to be left alone. The idea of bringing them into the civil war through a spirit quest, giving their warrior culture a role in the broader political conflict, speaks to a richer and more interconnected version of Skyrim that didn't survive into the final product. Huki Seven Swords had full dialogue. Huki Seven Swords, the cut jailkeeper of Windhelm's arena, wasn't just a name attached to an NPC shell. She was a fully voiced character with a personality that came through clearly in her remaining lines. She was blunt, practical, and entirely unsentimental. "What is this, you think you're clever?" she would ask, stepping between you and the unlocked cell door. If you wanted to fight in the pit to earn your freedom, you had to do it properly. No back alleys, no private arrangements, no shortcuts. Her lines carry the texture of someone who had been running the Bloodworks for years and had seen every angle. Her relationship markers show her as Brunwolf Freewinter's friend, which is an interesting connection to one of the only Windhelm characters who openly oppose the city's treatment of Dark Elves. Huki also has a tie to Benkum as his boss, and to Brond as a friend. She is a character, not a placeholder. A woman with a job, a history, and a world view, standing in a room that no player in the final game will ever visit. The Poetic Edda quest at the Bard's College. After completing the Tending the Flames questline at the Bard's College, the one that culminates in burning King Olaf's effigy at the Fire Festival, there was meant to be a follow-up quest called Collecting the Edda. Gerard Germain, the Bard's College historian, would have sent you across all of Skyrim to gather pieces of the Poetic Edda from bards you encountered in your travels. The Poetic Edda, as Viamo describes it in the game, is a living history of Skyrim, written and passed down by bards who have been studying at the college for generations. An oral tradition transformed into literature, preserved through verse. In the real world, the Poetic Edda is a genuine collection of Norse oral poetry, which makes this quest both an in-universe narrative and a quiet piece of real-world mythology. All that remains of it in the files is a single objective line. Collect parts of the Poetic Edda from bards you meet. The quest would have deepened the Bard's College from a faction with a single major quest line into a living institution with ongoing purpose. Instead, it sits unstarted, the pieces of the Edda scattered and unrecovered, the bards of Skyrim holding verses they were never asked to share, the Dark Brotherhood and Alain Dufont's hidden past. The Dark Brotherhood quest, Mourning Never, sends you to kill a bandit leader named Alain Dufont as part of a complex romantic revenge scheme. What the final game doesn't tell you is that Alain was once a pit fighter in Windhelm's cut arena. His remaining taunt dialogue, preserved in a branch still labelled DB03 Alain Pit Taunt Branch, is written as though he's addressing you as an opponent in a public fight, calling you Muri's champion, and delivering his lines as if they're meant for a bloodthirsty crowd. Based on the quest data for the arena combat encounter, in the pit version of his story, he would have fought you with an iron sword and shield, a very different weapon loadout from the unique Warhammer Aegisbane he carries in the final game. That Warhammer was very likely added after his arena role was removed and he was relocated to a bandit stronghold. The shift from Gladiator Iron to named Warhammer suggesting the character was given a new identity, along with a new location. His past as a pit fighter gives his death a strange additional weight. A man who once earned glory in a crowd, who survived fight after fight in Windhelm's underground, brought down quietly at the end of someone else's story. Trius and the jewelry box at Pilgrim's Trench. At Pilgrim's Trench, west of Winterhold, there is an abandoned camp, a bedroll, some scattered supplies, a note signed for Shelley that offers no explanation and asks no questions, just the quiet sadness of a message that was never delivered. The camp was meant to belong to a man named Trius, who would have appeared at this lonely stretch of northern coastline and asked you to dive into the wreck below and retrieve a jewelry box. Returning the box to him would have rewarded you with a new spell. Trius never appears in the final game. His camp exists. The shipwreck is there. The note is there. But Trius himself was never placed in the world, and so the jewelry box was never recovered. The spell was never given, and the Fasheli note sits in an unoccupied camp, like a letter that arrived after its recipient had already moved on. It is one of Skyrim's smallest and saddest pieces of missing content. Not a dungeon or a faction or a village, but simply a man standing at the water's edge with a story he never got to tell. The Ring of Khajiit, wearable invisibility that almost made it, hidden in Skyrim's game files, is an item called the Ring of Khajiit. Its enchantment, in the language of the creation kit, provides a 100% muffle effect combined with a significant boost to sneak, which, as modders noted when they examined its data, is as close as Skyrim's engine comes to wearable invisibility. The ring was designed to appear in Nightingale Hall once you completed the Thieves Guild questline, a fitting reward for a guild built entirely on silence and disappearance. In the final game, Nightingale Hall is a sparse and somewhat anticlimactic location that adds very little once the main questline ends. The Ring of Khajiit would have given players a reason to return, a permanent magical item with significant value that rewarded completion with something tangible and thematic. Some content restoration mods have added it back to the game at its intended location, where it fits naturally without requiring any changes to the world around it, as if it had simply been waiting on a shelf for someone to remember it was there. Siled Staff and the Subjugated Ghosts, Ranve's Fast, is one of Skyrim's more unsettling locations, a ruin operated by a mage named Siled the Warlock, who has been luring adventurers into cage traps and using their captured souls to power ghostly servants. The dungeon is complete, the questline works, and Syl dies on schedule. What doesn't exist in the final game is a staff he was supposed to carry. According to the UESP, Syld's staff exists in the data, but uses the wrong enchantment, likely why it was never placed in the world. The intent seems clear from the context. The staff was designed to let the Dragonborn summon those same subjugated ghosts as servants, turning the tools of Syl's cruelty against anything that stood in your way. The cutting room floor mod corrects the enchantment and restores the staff to his body, and players who use it describe the result as fitting the dungeon's atmosphere precisely, taking the instruments of someone else's imprisonment and turning them into your own power, with ghosts who apologize even as you command them to fight. The staff's absence from the vanilla game reads, based on what we know, less like a deliberate cut and more like an item that wasn't quite finished before the deadline arrived. The Frost River Farm, the meadery that Borvir and Rundi were building before their deaths in the final game, wasn't just an idea, it was a location. Frost River Farm appears in Skyrim's files as a real place, a farm situated east of the Solitude Sawmill, presumably a modest operation just beginning to establish itself. Some content restoration mods have rebuilt it exactly where the data says it belongs. When they do, they face an immediate and striking problem. The spot where the farm was designed to stand is, in the final game, occupied by a dragon mound. This could be a simple scheduling accident, a farm removed and a dragon mound placed in the same general area with no thematic intent. Or it could be read as something bleaker, a settlement erased not only from history, but from the physical landscape, replaced by the burial site of a creature that embodies the very force that upended everything. One restoration mod even made this coincidence into narrative. When the dragon buried there rises during the diplomatic immunity questline, it triggers the farm's destruction off-screen, as if the return of the dragons is what finally ended the brothers' dream. That interpretation is the modder's own invention, but it fits the coincidence so perfectly that it's become the story most players associate with the empty hillside where Frost River Farm was supposed to stand. Runil's Dark Past quest. Inside Falkreath's Hall of the Dead works an Ultima priest named Runil. He trains conjuration. He tends the graves. He will tell you, if you press him, that he has done terrible things in his past and that he lives with that weight every day. In the final game, that confession goes nowhere. There's no follow-up, no quest, no closure. But the files reveal that a quest called Runil's Dark Past was fully designed and partially voiced. The player would have been drawn into Runil's history, a history that involved things terrible enough that an elf who works among the dead in a quiet border town spent the rest of his long life trying to atone for them. What those things were exactly is unclear from the remaining data. The quest exists only in traces. A title, a script fragment, a priest who carries the weight of a story that was never quite finished. In the final game, he remains one of Skyrim's more memorable minor characters precisely because you can feel that weight without ever being told where it comes from. The NPC mourning system. Companion to the ghost haunting quest was a simpler but no less resonant system called mourning, labelled internally as WIKill01, where haunting dealt with the dead returning, mourning dealt with the living grieving. When a named NPC died, their spouse, their sibling, their friend, the surviving family member was meant to enter a visible state of grief for a set period of time. They would talk about their loss. Their daily schedule would reflect their sadness. The world, in small ways, would change around the absence of the person you had removed from it. Both haunting and mourning share the same developer prefix, conditioned not to start, which suggests they were disabled deliberately rather than left accidentally incomplete. The exact reason is unknown, though the most commonly offered explanation among fans and researchers is performance or complexity. Tracking death states, family relationships, and timed behavior changes across hundreds of named NPCs would have been an enormous technical and design burden. Whatever the cause, the world of Skyrim moves on without a ripple, which is perhaps less interesting than what Bethesda once imagined. The E3 demo version of Bleak Falls Barrow. Before Skyrim was released, Bethesda demonstrated it at E3 2011 with a playable build that was noticeably different from the shipped game. The internal IDE3 demo Bleak Falls Barrow still exists in the game's files, pointing to a version of the famous opening dungeon that no one who bought the game has ever explored. The E3 demo version included a sequence involving a fox and a hare, a wolf encounter, and a dragon attack, all within what would become the Bleak Falls Barrow quest area. before transitioning into something close to the familiar dungeon layout. At the end of the demo, a giant was shown being carried off by a dragon, followed immediately by a second dragon attacking. This sequence was never replicated in the shipped game. Bethesda has always shown carefully constructed demo experiences that differ from the final product. But the degree of difference here, different enemies, different sequencing, a giant carrying dragon that doesn't appear anywhere else, suggests the early months of Skyrim's development were far more experimental than the polished result implied. Mounted guard patrols were planned. In Skyrim's files, specifically within editor IDs for NPCs, are entries that were never connected to anything in the world. Guard Rorikstead Imperial Horse Patrol and Guard Rorikstead Sons Horse Patrol. The names are self-explanatory. They were meant to be guards on horseback, patrolling the roads of Skyrim in the colours of whichever faction held a given territory. In the final game, you occasionally encounter lone guards on foot outside city gates or stationed at crossroads, but the sense of a patrolled, watched, contested landscape, soldiers actually moving through the land they were fighting over, was never implemented. Mounted patrols would have made the Civil War feel real in a way that static camp placement never quite managed. They would have changed how you travelled, how visible your movements were, and how much the political situation of each hold felt like something actively enforced rather than simply declared. The Horse Patrol editor IDs exist in the game right now, orphaned, attached to nothing, pointing toward a Skyrim where the roads felt occupied. Domna Magia and the Cut Vampire quest in Solitude. There is a disabled NPC named Domna Magia standing, silently, invisibly, right in front of Solitude's Hall of the Dead. She cannot be seen. She will not respond to you. She is simply there, positioned and waiting, held in a state of permanent inactivation by a developer flag. Her purpose, according to the data attached to her, was to be involved in a vampire-related quest that was removed from the final game, specifically a quest labelled V02 in the files, the second of 3 planned vampire storylines. The first of those quests would have involved stealing an artifact called the Bloodfire Amulet, and V02 would have sent the player to Solitude specifically to kill Domna Magia. What role she played in the vampire clan conflict the quests were building toward isn't documented in any surviving dialogue. The fact that she was placed in a specific spot at the Hall of the Dead and tied to what appears to have been an emerging vampire faction storyline in the base game suggests a thread of narrative that would have brought Skyrim's undead threat to Solitude before the Dawnguard DLC gave vampires their own major expansion. Instead, Domna Magia stands at the door of the Hall of the Dead, invisible to everyone, holding a story that was cancelled before it could be told. The Spectral Arrow spell. One of the smallest and strangest pieces of cut content is a spell called Spectral Arrow. In its designed form, it would have been given to the player as a reward for completing the Infiltration quest, a fort assault mission that takes place at Trevor's Watch near Everstead, where you help a man reclaim his keep from bandits. In the final game, completing Infiltration rewards you with Detect Life. Spectral Arrow was designed as an alternative, a Conjuration School projectile that deals direct damage and staggers the target. Notably, one of the only damage-dealing spells in the game outside of the Destruction School. The spell also fires silently without needing the silent casting perk, which is what links it thematically to the questline's sneaky, infiltration-based nature. The spell tome for it still exists in the files. The Cutting Room Floor mod reassigns it to its intended location as the Infiltration reward, and players who receive it describe it as fitting the stealth and shadow theme of the questline far better than Detect Life. It's a minor change in scope, but it speaks to how much careful thematic work was once being done on individual quest rewards before time pressure collapsed the space for nuance. The Sarthal Miners. When you first descend into Sarthal at the beginning of the College of Winterhold questline, the ancient Nordic ruins feel properly abandoned. Dust and silence and something deeply old pressing in from the walls. But in an earlier version of the questline, you wouldn't have gone in alone. Miners were meant to accompany the college expedition into the ruins. Two distinct groups had been designed: Bosmer miners with one voice type and Dunmer miners with another, sharing a set of 5 dialogue lines between them. They would have made the opening sequence feel more like an actual archaeological expedition. Cautious researchers, workers with torches, the sound of voices echoing in spaces that hadn't heard living speech in centuries. Their presence also would have raised the emotional stakes when the ancient power within Sarthal activated, turning a solo dungeon crawl into the beginning of a disaster with witnesses. The dialogue still exists in the audio files. The miners were fully voiced before someone decided they weren't necessary, and Sarthal swallowed them whole before the game ever launched. The Riften Ratway ambush scene. The Ratway beneath Riften is one of the game's more atmospheric locations, a network of sewer passages populated with desperate people, petty criminals, and the occasional assassin. A character named Draf lurks in the Ratway in the final game, but his behavior was meant to be different. Originally, Draf was scripted to approach you and attempt to rob you, rather than simply attacking on sight. The difference sounds small, but it changes the entire texture of the encounter. A thief who robs you can be reasoned with, deceived, intimidated, or simply handed coin to walk away. A thief who attacks is just a combat encounter. The ambush rob version of Draf was designed to play out as a scene, a forced dialogue, a choice, a moment of tension in a narrow sewer corridor. Some content restoration mods have reinstated this interaction, and players who encounter it in its restored form consistently report that it feels more in keeping with a place called the Ratway than the straightforward combat encounter Bethesda shipped. Captain Metilius and the Dragon Investigation. In the final game, the quest Dragon Rising sends you and Irileth to investigate dragon activity at the Western Watchtower outside Whiterun, alongside a squad of Whiterun guards. But a separate cut Civil War mission existed for the Imperial Legion side that would have involved a completely different dragon encounter. Captain Metilius, an unused Imperial soldier who still exists in the game's files with his own voice and faction placement, would have been sent alongside you to Fort Ragstad to investigate reports of a dragon there. He and a squad of friendly Legion soldiers would have helped you fight the creature. An event that, based on the remaining quest data, seems to have mirrored the structure of the Whiterun Watchtower fight, with an Imperial officer replacing Irileth in that supporting role. Metilius has no remaining dialogue of his own, but his AI package keeps him in Castle Door's war room for as long as the Jagged Crown quest is running. A behavioral artifact from what appears to have been an earlier design, where he had a defined role in that questline as well. He's a soldier waiting for orders that never came, standing at a war room table, watching a campaign he was never permitted to join. Henrik, the Wolfskull victim. Wolfskull Cave is a place of dark magic, a ritual site near Solitude, where a necromancer named Potema was being summoned back from the dead. But in the original design, someone was meant to have gotten there before you. An NPC named Henrik, labeled in the files with the editor IDMS-06 victim, was meant to appear in Wolfskull Cave as a victim of whatever ritual was taking place. He has no voice type. He carries nothing. He wears farm clothes and boots. He's entirely silent. A dead man in a circumstance that should have told a story about what the cave had already cost someone before the player arrived. In the final game, Wolfskull Cave is populated only with necromancers and conjured spirits, with no sense that any innocent had been caught up in the ritual. Henrik would have provided that human anchor, a name on a corpse, a face to the cost of something dark, a reason to feel the weight of what was being undone inside that mountain. The college guard who wore destruction robes near Sarthol during the Under Sarthol quest line. A college guard was meant to be stationed to protect the miners and expedition members operating at the ruins. The guard that exists in the files is strange. He uses a standard Imperial Guard AI template, but is always set to level 40, wearing master robes of destruction rather than any conventional guard armor, and carrying a full roster of offensive spells. He is, by design, more powerful mage than guard, a college-affiliated protector who happened to carry the title of guard in the same way that a Winterhold soldier might carry the title scholar. His level 40 designation with a guard template means his stats were never properly calculated. He was technically level 40, but would have been functionally weak, a high rank on a miscalculated body. He belongs to the Guard faction, Winterhold's crime faction, and the Guard dialogue faction, giving him all the right affiliations for the world he was meant to inhabit. The Ulfric post-war speech that was silenced. In the Civil War's Stormcloak ending, the sequence plays out in solitude as Ulfric Stormcloak's forces take the city and General Tullius is defeated. But the cut version of this scene was longer. An unused dialogue line exists in Ulfric's audio files in which, standing over the city he has just conquered, he delivers the following summary of his victory. The Empire is obsolete. It's a single line, clipped and deliberate. The kind of thing a conqueror would say to the camera after a long campaign. And it was removed, most likely because Bethesda wanted the moral ambiguity of the Stormcloak victory to remain intact, rather than letting Ulfric turn it into a declaration of triumph. In the final game, the Stormcloak ending is surprisingly muted, and deliberately so. The restored version of that line, added back by the Cutting Room Floor mod, shifts the tone entirely. Suddenly, Ulfric sounds less like a freedom fighter, and more like a man who has been building toward that sentence for decades. The Thieves Guild variant armor inside Skyrim's data files, in the section that lists items whose models, textures, and icons are fully created but which were never assigned to any location in the game world, is a full set of Thieves Guild variant armor. The textures are complete, the mesh exists, the item is defined. It simply has no location, no leveled list that includes it, no chest that contains it, no merchant who carries it, no character who wears it. The Thieves Guild questline has some of the most distinctive armor in the game, with the standard set and the upgraded Nightingale equipment. But the existence of a variant suggests that a third tier or alternative star was planned and abandoned. Whether it was cut for time, for balance reasons, or because someone decided 2 armor options were sufficient, the finished product sits in the archive waiting to be pulled out and worn. It is complete in every detail except the one that matters most: its place in the world. The short-sleeved shrouded armor. The Dark Brotherhood's signature outfit, the shrouded armor, exists in 2 forms in the game files. The version the player wears in the final game is the complete set with long sleeves. But a short-sleeved variant also exists in the male armor files, fully textured, fully functional, simply never assigned to any location or character. Whether this was an alternate design that was tried and set aside, or a plan for a specific questline reward or character outfit, the data doesn't say. What it does say is that someone at Bethesda modeled, textured, and implemented an alternate version of one of the game's most recognizable armor sets, and then declined to use it. In the world of Dark Brotherhood aesthetics, where the shrouded garments are tied specifically to the Night Mother's blessing, even the sleeve length carries lore implications. And those implications were never explored. Argi Farsha and the sister of Idgrod Ravencrone. Among Skyrim's unused NPCs is an intriguing character named Argi Farsha, a Nord mystic whose relationship markers in the creation kit identify her as the sister of Idgrod Ravencrone, the visionary and slightly unsettling Jarl of Morthul. Idgrod herself is one of the more compelling minor characters in the game, a woman who experiences prophetic visions and is regarded by her people with a mixture of reverence and quiet concern. Having a sister who shares or extends that mystic quality would have added considerable depth to Morthul's sense of being a place touched by something strange. Argi wears farm clothes and boots, suggesting a more grounded existence than her Jarl sister, but her classification as a mystic implies that whatever gift runs in that family's blood didn't skip her entirely. She was designed for the game. She has a relationship to her named character. She was simply never placed anywhere in the world, never given dialogue, never given a home, as if she stepped out of the lore and then kept stepping until she was no longer in the game at all. The lost village of Granite Hill. Skyrim's world map contains a ghost. If you open the local map near the Great Henge Resurrection Dragon Mound, sitting on the border between Falkreath Hold and Whiterun Hold, near Fort Sungard, the game will quietly display the name Granite Hill over a stretch of empty landscape. A settlement that was fully planned, written into lore, referenced by Jarl Siggeir himself in conversation with his steward Nenya, and removed before a single building was placed. The lore book, Holdings of Jarl Gjalund, describes Granite Hill as 3 farms and an inn, sitting just north of Falkreath, a crossroads community that thrived on agriculture and trade. The carriage system script still lists it as a possible destination. The Civil War scripts mention it, with the note explicitly cut from game. Even a recurring Dark Brotherhood target has an internal editor ED referencing her as belonging to Granite Hill, suggesting she was meant to live there before Bethesda emptied the space and replaced it with open air and dragon bones. What once would have been a living community with daily schedules, local gossip, and a warm inn fire is now nothing more than a label on an empty hillside, and the Jarl still talks about it like it's real. Heliarchen, the town that became a hearthfire house. The village of Heljarchen had a fate more interesting than most cut content. It didn't fully disappear. It was repurposed. Heljarchen was intended to be a proper settlement in the Pale, and the game's files confirm that it would have had at least 2 farmhouses, an apothecary, a blacksmith, and its own inn. 6 named NPCs were designed for the village and then removed. The inn survived. In the final game, the Nightgater Inn exists as a lonely, standalone building in the wilderness of the Pale, seemingly with no reason to be so far from anywhere. That's because it was once supposed to be the beating heart of a village, Heliarchen's public house. the kind of place where locals would warm themselves and travelers would stop before continuing north toward Dawnstar. When the village was cut, the inn remained, like a chair still set at a table with no room around it. And then, in the Hearthfire DLC, Bethesda quietly gave the name a second life. The buildable player home in the Pale is called Heljaken Hall. The village never existed in the final game, but its name was too good to waste entirely. The Insane College Wizard Quest. Among the College of Winterhold's unused quest lines is one called Rogue Wizard, and its premise is simple enough to be compelling. A high elf mage has been wandering one of Skyrim's holds, causing enough chaos that the Jarl has complained to the college, and the college, having severed all ties with the wizard, has tasked the player with tracking him down and taking care of the problem. The quest is classified as a repeatable Radiant quest, designed to trigger after the completion of the Eye of Magnus, the college's main quest line. Its internal note states it was not supposed to have a reward, which gives it an interesting quality. A cleanup job, an obligation, something you do not for gold, but because you are now, by virtue of having saved the college, the person the college calls when things go wrong. The Insane College Wizard NPC still exists in the files. A high elf wearing expert robes of destruction, wandering some unnamed hold, his presence somewhere in Skyrim's landscape, an ongoing unresolved problem for an institution you may have forgotten you belong to. The Soul Gem Filling Quest for Sergius. Sergius Turianus, the enchanting teacher at the College of Winterhold, has an unfinished quest tied to his character. The quest, which exists in the game's files as a partially scripted but never triggering task, would have seen him ask the player to help fill a grand soul gem for him. That's the entirety of it. A repeatable Radiant errand, simple and domestic, the kind of favor a teacher asks of a capable student who happens to be passing through. Soul gems are found throughout Skyrim in abundance, and filling them with combat souls is a routine part of any mage or enchanter's life. The quest would have made Sergius feel like a living presence in the college, rather than a merchant behind a counter, a researcher with ongoing projects, a colleague who occasionally needed a hand. Small as it is, its absence is part of why the College of Winterhold, despite being the game's magic faction, can feel strangely impersonal once the main quest line ends. The teachers were designed to have needs. Most of those needs were never activated. Neria's stolen research notes. Another cut College of Winterhold quest involves two instructors and a conflict that speaks to the quiet politics of academic life. Neria, a high elf mage whose ambitions are visible in the few lines she does have in the final game, would have approached the player with a request. Steal Feralda's research notes. Once you had them, you'd face a choice. Hand them to Neria, who would reward you with gold, or return them to Feralda and expose the theft. Turning Neria in apparently offered no material reward, which is both thematically interesting and practically frustrating. The quest illuminates something about the college as a place, competitive, politically tense, full of people who have been sharing a small roof for decades and have developed complicated feelings about each other. In the final game, Neria and Feralda both exist, but their tension is only implied in ambient dialogue. The quest would have made that rivalry explicit, given its stakes, and forced the player to take a side. The Mahulak Wife Quest, in the Orc stronghold of Nazulbur. Chief Mahulak has a history with women that the game hints at, but never explores. He mentions being unlucky in love. His previous wives, in the lore of the stronghold, did not survive long. There was a quest designed to follow up on this. The player would speak to Mohulach, hear him mention a woman named Uglaz from his past, and then venture out into the wilderness to find her and bring her back. The quest would have led somewhere in the hills around the stronghold, tracking down a woman who had presumably left under circumstances that no one quite explained. What the reunion would have meant, whether Uglaz would have been willing, reluctant, hostile, or heartbroken, the files don't say. What they do say is that someone at Bethesda thought this chief's domestic history was interesting enough to build a quest around, and that for reasons unknown, the journey to bring Uglaz home was quietly cancelled before it could begin. The gold sapphire necklace. Sometimes the cut content in Skyrim is not a quest or an NPC or a location, but simply a single object, small and elegant and overlooked. The gold sapphire necklace is listed in the game's unobtainable items as fully implemented. Its model, its enchantment data, its leveled list, placement were all completed, but it was never assigned to any loot pool, any merchant inventory, or any location in the world. In the final game, it exists only in the code. Some content restoration mods add it to appropriate jewelry leveled lists, and once they do, it appears naturally in the world alongside comparable items, its absence never having been visually apparent to anyone who didn't know to look. It should have been able to count as a gift for children, according to its item flags. It should have appeared in merchants' inventories once the player reached a high enough level. Instead, it sat in the archive while a child somewhere in Skyrim waited for a piece of jewelry that technically existed but was never quite in the world. The Thieves' Guild Hood Alt. Another piece of unobtainable armor in Skyrim's files is an alternate version of the Thieves' Guild hood, fully modeled, textured and defined, but never placed anywhere in the game world. The Thieves' Guild questline is one of the longer and more developed faction storylines in Skyrim, and the guild itself is visually distinctive with its dark leather sets and careful styling. Whether this alternate hood was designed for a specific character, a higher tier reward, or simply as a design variation that was tried and set aside is impossible to determine from the files alone. What's certain is that someone made it with enough detail to implement it properly, and then it was removed from every inventory, every chest, every leveled list, present in the game's data, but absent from its world, in exactly the same way that so much of Skyrim's cut content is absent. Finished, waiting, and completely invisible. Karlia's armor. The Nightingale set that never reached players. Karlia is one of the most distinctive characters in the Thieves' Guild questline. A Dunmer archer and former Nightingale whose exile and mission drive the second half of the storyline. She has a unique armor set in the game's files, listed under female unobtainable items as Karlia's armor. It is distinct from the standard Nightingale armor that the player receives as part of the Nightingale questline. It is her armor, personal and non-transferable, designed with the specificity of a character piece rather than a player reward. In the final game, Karlia wears a version of the standard Nightingale set, indistinguishable from what you eventually wear yourself. Her unique set was designed, given its own entry, and then left unused, perhaps because implementing personal, non-equipable gear for a companion character added complexity without adding anything the player could meaningfully interact with. But her armor exists. It was built for her. It simply lives in the archive, attributed and complete, worn by no one. Tun's armor, the god's equipment you can never wear. Tun is the ancient Nordic god of trials who guards the Whalebone Bridge in Sovngarde, the Nordic afterlife you visit at the end of Skyrim's main questline. He is enormous, ancient, and nearly impossible to kill, a being whose armor reflects his divine station. Tsun's armor exists in Skyrim's files as an unobtainable item. It was modeled, given stats, and defined as male armor, but it was never placed in any loot pool or made accessible to the player through any normal means. The philosophical implications of this are mildly amusing. Tsun exists specifically to test whether you are worthy of passage to Sovngarde, and his armor, were you ever to obtain it, would make you visually identical to the god who challenged you. Perhaps that's why it was never made available, or perhaps the armor was built as a technical necessity, a fully realized piece of equipment for a fully realized character, without any intention of making it a reward. Either way, it stands as one of Skyrim's most visually striking pieces of unobtainable content. Locked behind a god who blocks the bridge to death itself, the Stormcloak sleeved cuirass. The Stormcloak's blue armor is iconic. The bare design, the rough craftsmanship, the sense of a people who made their armor from what they had and wore it with pride. But the standard Stormcloak cuirass in the final game is sleeveless, and a sleeved version exists in the files that was meant to be part of the regular distribution. The Stormcloak cuirass, with sleeves, is a full armor piece that went through the same amulet slot corrections applied to the standard version, suggesting it was treated as a real item through the bug-fixing phase of development, before someone decided it wasn't necessary in the final product. Cutting Room Floor adds it to leveled lists, and when it appears in the world, players note that it looks like a natural variation, the kind of thing different Stormcloak soldiers would reasonably wear depending on what was available to them in a province at war. Its absence is never obvious. Its presence, modders report, makes the Stormcloak troops feel more varied, more human, and slightly less like a uniform. The Imperial Wizard who wore guard armor. In the unused NPCs list sits an Imperial Wizard, a mage in Imperial Guard equipment, wearing an Imperial Guard outfit as light armor rather than conventional mage robes, carrying a leveled warlock dagger and a full slate of combat spells. He was designed to be used in the Civil War siege sequences, a mage functioning within the hierarchy of the Imperial military, wearing a guard's uniform rather than academic robes. His existence implies a version of the Civil War's Imperial faction that had magical personnel integrated directly into the guard structure. Mages in armor, not mages in towers, soldiers who also happen to know Firebolt. In the final game, the Imperial Legion uses no such hybrid fighters. Its soldiers are soldiers, and its mages, if they exist at all, are segregated into the college. This unnamed wizard standing in his guard armor with a warlock dagger and a ready oak flesh spell suggests a more militarized and tactically flexible legion than the one that made it to release. The Brinehammer Journal Quest. At the wreck of the Brinehammer, a sunken ship on Skyrim's northern coast, there is a journal. In the cut version of the game, picking up this journal would have started a quest. You would bring it to Giro Gemin at the Bard's College to have it assessed, and Girod's response, reading through the waterlogged pages, would have formed the body of the quest's narrative. Almost all of the subtitles for this interaction still exist in the game's dialogue views files. The voiced dialogue for Girod reading the journal was fully recorded and still exists in the audio files. The Brinehammer itself is a real location in the final game, a wreck you can dive into, explore, and loot. But without the quest, the journal is simply another book on a submerged shelf, carrying no particular significance. Giro Gemin, at the Bard's College, in solitude, goes on collecting old texts and maintaining the college's archive without ever receiving the one thing this unknown mariner carried to the bottom of the sea: Berna's burial urn and the bad trade quest. In Winterhold's small, freezing collection of shops is a merchant named Berna, who currently sells you a coral dragon claw. In the cut version of the game, she had a different purpose. A quest called Bad Trade would have seen her sell you a burial urn and ask you to return it to Ingle Barrow, placing it where it belonged. Completing the task would have rewarded you with 200 gold. The quest advances to stage 20 in the current game, meaning the game partially recognizes that you purchased the claw from her, but nothing else can happen because the quest's remaining stages were never implemented. Ingle Barrow is a real location in the final game, a place of Nordic burial lore connected to a famous ghost and the history of the Ysgramor bloodline. The burial urn that was meant to be returned there would have deepened that connection, turning the barrow from a dungeon you clear and forget into a place with an ongoing relationship to the living town nearby. Berna still sells things in her shop. The urn was never completed. The barrow doesn't know it's missing anything. The Lod's Lot quest. Lod is the blacksmith of Falkreath, a pragmatic craftsman who asks you early in the game to find him a dog, a request that leads to the Barber's questline and the Daedric artifact Clavicus Vial. But in an earlier version of Skyrim, Lod wasn't just a blacksmith. He was a struggling farmer who had turned to grave robbing to make ends meet. A cut quest called Lod's Lot would have had him offer you a book, the proceeds of some dark excavation. You could accept the book and receive gifts from him, or you could turn him into Kust, the gravekeeper at Falkreath's Hall of the Dead, and expose his crimes. The choice had no reward for taking the moral path, which is either a design oversight or a deliberate statement about the economics of virtue in a world as hard as Skyrim. The quest would have also given Lod a past, a man who arrived in Falkreath with nothing, who made terrible choices to survive, who is now hammering at the forge every day and hoping no one remembers what the ground under the cemetery gave up. The headsmen and the unimplemented execution. 2 unused Nord headsmen exist in Skyrim's NPC files, tied to an unimplemented world interaction labeled WEDL11. They both wear executioner outfits and carry headsman's axes, the kind of equipment that belongs to a public event, not a private dungeon. The nature of WEDL11 is unclear from surviving data. No description of what the encounter would have shown exists beyond the NPCs themselves and their equipment. What seems clear is that it would have been some form of random encounter involving an execution that players could stumble across while traveling. Public executions were already a significant feature of Skyrim's social world. The game opens with one, and the idea that you might stumble across another one in progress, in some town or at some crossroads, while simply walking through the province, would have added another layer of texture to the game's feudal atmosphere. The 2 headsmen wait in the files, axes in hand, for an event that was never scheduled, dressed for a ceremony that never arrived, standing at attention for a day that came and went while the rest of Skyrim moved on. The insane college wizard's wander route. One of the more atmospheric details about the Rogue Wizard quest is how it was designed to work. It wasn't a dungeon. The target wasn't in a cave or a keep. The insane college wizard was meant to be wandering, present somewhere in one of Skyrim's holds, disrupting daily life, a loose thread in the world's fabric rather than a contained enemy encounter. This made the quest inherently different from most of Skyrim's combat objectives. Instead of going to a marked location and clearing it, you would have been hunting someone who was already in motion, whose presence in a populated area created risks you would have had to manage. The college's awkward position, officially severing ties with the wizard while privately commissioning his removal, also adds a note of institutional cynicism that the final college questline rarely achieves. The archmage who sends you to take care of a mage problem has a different texture than the archmage who sends you into ancient ruins for relics. The college, as an institution, would have felt more complicated for it. The spirit quest, an orc blood kinship. The cut civil war mission involving Makel Abbas would have done something the final game never quite manages: create a functional, respectful pathway between the Dragonborn and the orc strongholds. In the final game, blood kinship status is earned by completing a favor, quest, typically a small errand for a stronghold member, or by being an orc yourself. It is accessible but quiet, with no grand ceremony. The spirit quest with Makel would have been different. A shared ritual, a spiritual undertaking, a moment of genuine communion between the Dragonborn and a culture that otherwise keeps its distance from outsiders. And at the end of it, an orc who was also a warrior would have marched beside you into civil war battles, making the conflict feel less like an argument between two human political factions and more like a conflict that touched everyone in Skyrim, even those who preferred to stay behind their stone walls. The Frost River Mead delivery destinations. What makes the Cut Supply Line quest particularly vivid is how specifically it was designed. This wasn't a vague errand with a generic destination. Borvir and Rundy's Frost River Mead was to be delivered to 3 specific locations: Candle Hearth Hall in Windhelm, the Frozen Hearth in Tititunt Winterhold, and the Bannered Mare in Whiterun. Each of these inns has his own voice for the innkeeper who was scripted to receive the delivery. Elder Early Dawn in Windhelm, Dagger in Winterhold, Hulda in Whiterun. All of them have dialogue in the audio files responding to the Mead's arrival. The fact that specific voices were recorded for specific characters at specific locations means this was never an abstract design document. It was a completed quest that was cut at the last stage, after all the work was done. Somewhere in the final game, Elder Early Dawn serves drinks behind her bar. Dagger wipes down the counter by the college, and Hulda takes coin from companions and merchants alike. And none of them know that somewhere in the cold hills near Winterhold, 2 brothers froze in the snow instead of delivering the bottle of mead they had all been waiting for. The Bleak Falls Barrow Aishki 3 giant, among the details of the E3 demo version of Skyrim. One stands out for its sheer visual strangeness, a giant being carried away by a dragon. This was not a combat event or a puzzle. The giant simply appeared, existed for a moment at the edge of the demo space, and was then snatched by a dragon that swept through the scene. It has no equivalent anywhere in the final game. Giants in the shipped version of Skyrim are earthbound creatures, massive, slow, territorial, anchored to their mammoths and their camps. The idea that a dragon might interact with one, might specifically target one, suggests a world where the returned dragons were predatory in ways that extended beyond human settlements. Whether the giant was being hunted, displaced, or simply caught in the wrong moment, the image of that creature being lifted from the ground implies a chaos at the top of the food chain that the final game never quite captured. The dragons of the final Skyrim attack people and towns. The dragon of the E3 demo carried a giant away. The Riften Conspiracy's lost third act, the quest, Forsworn Conspiracy, in Markarth, is one of Skyrim's more narratively ambitious storylines, dropping you into a cover-up that reaches the highest levels of the city's power. But the Riften quest line was supposed to have a similar scope. In the game's files, the remnants of an extended Riften conspiracy are preserved. 2 wardrobes named Riada's wardrobe and Ildine's wardrobe. Blank dialogue topics for Eltris's Riften counterpart, and reference to an investigation into Nana Ildine that was meant to form the 2nd or 3rd act of a larger Riften conspiracy storyline. What the conspiracy involved, who was behind it, and what it would have uncovered in the city built on top of the Thieves' Guild, none of that survives in any complete form. Only the containers remain, labelled with names empty, waiting for evidence that was never planted, and a story that was never finished. The Whiterun Stables scene that unlocked a quest, a small but telling piece of cut content, involves Uthgerd the Unbroken and Skulver Sable Hilt, the horse trader at Whiterun Stables. A scripted scene between them was designed to play out the first time you passed the stables, an overheard conversation that would have functioned as an alternative starting trigger for the quest Delayed Burial. In the final game, Delayed Burial starts when you pass the stables and encounter Lorius Farm, or simply by approaching the cart on the road north of Whiterun. The Uthgerd and Skulvar scene was designed to seed the quest earlier, in a more populated and visible location, creating a moment of ambient storytelling at a place you'd almost certainly visit during your first few hours in the game. The scene still exists in the game's dialogue files. Skulver will still occasionally mention a jester on the road in his ambient dialogue, a leftover that points back to the cut scene, a loose thread of conversation leading nowhere. A stable hand still talking about a wagon he was told to remember. Gallus's decoded journal in Nightingale Hall. After completing the Thieves' Guild questline, Nightingale Hall, the hidden sanctuary of Skyrim's most elite thieves, becomes accessible but empty. It is a beautifully atmospheric location with no particular reason to return to it. But one item was designed to make it worth a visit. Gallus's decoded journal, the translated copy of the cipher your quest began with. In the final game, the journal is used during the quest and then disappears. The cutting room floor mod restores it to a shelf in Nightingale Hall, where it appears once the final major portion of the Thieves' Guild quest is complete. It is a small thing, a book on a shelf, a relic of a story you lived through, but it transforms Nightingale Hall from a beautiful empty room into a space with accumulated history. The journal that started everything ends up in the hall where its author, Gallus, once stood. It is the kind of detail that makes a world feel like it has a memory. The General Tullius Cut speech line, Ulfric Stormcloak's missing post-war declaration, isn't the only cut dialogue from the Civil War's ending. In General Tullius's defeat sequence, when he faces the Dragonborn and Ulfric in the Solitude Jarl's palace, the final version of the scene is relatively restrained. But there were additional lines written for the aftermath. Generic post-Civil War battle lines for both Elisif the Fair and Erica. Solitude's prominent imperial merchants that were never implemented. The existence of these lines suggests a more extended sequence in which Solitude's surviving citizens had visible reactions to the city's change of hands. Public figures adjusting politically to the new reality. The final game cuts to aftermath quickly. These lingering lines imply that someone, somewhere in development, thought it was important to watch the city reconfigure itself in real time, to see the people who had served one cause begin the process of deciding who they would be in the next era. The Wolfskull Cave. Alternate dungeon identity. The internal files for South Fringe Sanctum, a necromancer dungeon, contain a strange series of mismatches. Many of its markers and dialogue names reference Boulderful Cave, a completely different necromancer dungeon, as if the quest was written for one location, partially moved to another, and the references were never fully updated. More peculiarly, the dialogue topic where you ask the dungeon's captive NPC Selveni if she's a necromancer is internally named Dun Boulderful QST You're a Werewolf, a name that combines the wrong dungeon with the wrong creature type. This ghost of a quest suggests a version of the dungeon in which the captive character had a deeper story, possibly involving lycanthropy, rather than just being caught in a necromancer's lair. The werewolf dialogue topic points to a version of the encounter in which Selveni might have been suspected of transformation, rather than necromancy. A different crime in a place that already dealt in different crimes. The escaped prisoner world interaction among Skyrim's unused NPCs are two characters, both simply named Escaped Prisoner. The first exists only in a test cell and is believed to have been designed for a world interaction that was never implemented. The kind of brief, atmospheric random encounter you might stumble across while traveling a road. He has a voice track, but no items, no faction membership, and no dialogue beyond what the voice track suggests. The second escaped prisoner appears to be a template for leveled list generation, rather than a specific character. What the world interaction would have involved: a chase, a pursuit, a desperate fugitive asking for help, or someone simply running from something in the opposite direction, is unclear from the files. But the framing implies something alive and temporal. Not a dungeon cleared, not a camp explored, but a moment in motion, a story in the middle of its own telling, crossing the road in front of you and disappearing into the trees. Castle Dour's secret tower view. In Solitude, General Tullius holds court in Castle Dour, a military installation with a war room and the efficient, humorless atmosphere of an imperial command center. What most players never see, even in the final game, is an additional wing that was designed but left inaccessible. Castle Dour Tower was meant to house Tullius's private quarters, and more importantly, a viewpoint from which Solitude's grand coastal landscape could be seen from above. Some content restoration mods restore access to the tower, and the view from it, Solitude's cliff-edge city spread below, the sea of ghosts stretching north, is striking enough to make its absence feel like a genuine loss. Whether Tullius would have had anything interesting to say from that tower, whether quests or letters or personal items would have been placed there to deepen his characterization, the data doesn't fully say. What it does say is that the view existed, that someone built it, and that in the final game, the door to that tower remains closed. The carriage system's ghost destinations. Skyrim's carriage system allows you to fast travel between major cities from the stable outside each hold capital. But the carriage script contains destinations that don't exist in the final game. Granite Hill is listed. The internal list of carriage endpoints, compiled during a version of the game in which these settlements were still planned, was never fully cleaned up when those settlements were removed. This means there are vestiges of an entire transportation network built around a Skyrim with more populated communities. A Skyrim where you could ride a horse-drawn cart to a village that is now an empty hillside and ask the driver to take you somewhere that the final game forgot to build. The carts still sit outside city gates. The horses still wait. The drivers still know the names. They just no longer know which road to take to get there. The Iron Tree Lumber Mill of Harfingar. In the data files for Harfingar, location scripting and NPC references point to a mill that was once planned but never constructed. The Iron Tree Lumber Mill, so named in the location data, would have occupied a space between the Thalmor Embassy and Ironback hideout in Harfinger's interior, run by two brothers alongside their guards, with a house named Trilf's House attached to the property. In the final game, this stretch of countryside is empty. The mill was cut sometime during development, but its absence is still partially visible. A character named Trilf appears in the game in a different context, his editor ID still pointing back to a mill he was meant to operate. Trilf still runs a sawmill in the final game, just not the one that was cut. He was relocated and reassigned, his original occupation preserved only as a name in a data file. Aoi, reminder that someone at Bethesda decided a lumber worker was worth keeping, even after the lumber mill that defined him was removed from the world. The Maiden Loom Manor that was never built. In Whiterun, the city that more players spend more time in than any other location in the game, there was supposed to be an additional building. Maiden Loom Manor was designed as the home of Lilith Maiden Loom, a named Whiterun resident who never appears in the final game. The location data for the manor exists. The NPC was designed, but the manor itself was never built into Whiterun's layout, and Lilith never took up residence in the house that bore her name. Whiterun in the final game is a city of carefully counted buildings. You can walk its streets and identify each structure by function and resident. The space where Maiden Loom Manor would have stood is occupied by open air or a different building, and most players will never notice the gap. But in the files, the house exists by name attributed to a woman who also exists by name, both of them waiting in some architectural and biographical limbo, the resident of a house that was designed but never laid in stone. The werewolf in a cage near Whiterun. Among the points of interest that were meant to dot Skyrim's landscape is an unmarked encounter that was designed to appear in the Whiterun tundra. A werewolf in a cage. This is a striking image in the context of Skyrim's world, where werewolves are associated with the companions, and their transformation is treated as a powerful and somewhat sacred inheritance. A caged werewolf implies capture, implies someone powerful enough to have done the capturing, and implies an ongoing story about what happens to those who were caught in their change. Who put it there? Who is the werewolf? Are they still conscious inside the transformation? Do they want to be freed? The encounter was restored as a point of interest in some content mods, and players who encounter it report feeling exactly the right kind of productive unease. The sense that the world contains things that have already happened, decisions already made, situations already in motion that you are stumbling into rather than initiating. The Sven Dragon Ballad Conversation. In Riverwood, the bard Sven has a dialogue line that will almost certainly never trigger in a normal playthrough. A conversation about old ballads concerning dragons, tied to a dialogue topic that was connected to the wrong topic branch and therefore inaccessible. The line is intact. The voice is there. Sven has the knowledge and the willingness to talk about the old songs, the ancient stories about dragons that Nords preserved in verse long after the creatures themselves had supposedly vanished. He just can't be asked about it. The cutting room floor mod corrects the broken topic connection, but only on a new game. Certain dialogue states, the notes explain, bake into save files during character creation, and can't be retroactively unlocked. It is one of the game's smallest broken threads. A bard who knows the old songs about the things that are now falling from the sky, standing in the town at the beginning of your journey, unable to be asked what he knows. The painted cow and the apple. There is a specific, beautifully strange detail in the Goldar mission's remaining data that deserves its own attention. To coax the painted cow that you were supposed to acquire for the giant, you didn't simply take it on a lead. You fed it an apple. The mechanic of feeding a cow an apple to get it to follow you, a small, domestic, almost tender interaction, embedded in a military mission about giant diplomacy, is the kind of design detail that reveals what games can be when their developers have time to be playful. The painted cow has a specific model in the files. The apple feeding interaction was scripted. Someone spent time designing the moment when the Dragonborn, champion of the Civil War, would crouch down to offer an apple to a painted livestock animal while a 20-foot giant waited in the tundra. That detail was removed when the mission was cut, and Skyrim became slightly more serious and slightly less strange for its absence. The Thornfield and Cut World spaces. Beyond the named settlements, Skyrim's development history contains references to world spaces and locations that barely left traces, areas that were tested, built to some degree, and then either consolidated into existing locations or abandoned entirely. The TCRF and UESP archives contain references to what appeared to be inaccessible cells and half-built environments that were never connected to the game's main navigation system. Some of these spaces were functional enough to be reached via console commands. Others exist only as empty containers in the data, named for places that were once planned and never realized. The scope of what was cut from Skyrim's geography is difficult to fully measure precisely because so much of it was removed cleanly, not left in a state you could stumble into, but excised from the map and from the carriage system and from the NPCs who would have lived there, leaving only the occasional ghost of a name in a script that forgot to clean up after itself. Castor the Puzzle Maker. In the Dragonborn DLC, within the confines of Dampool Mine on Solstheim, there was supposed to be a corpse. A dark elf named Castor the Puzzle Maker was designed to appear in the mine alongside a dead bandit highwayman, his body telling a small story about what had happened in that place before the player arrived. Castor was an apparently notable figure, someone who made puzzles, which in a Nordic context likely means trap mechanisms, locked doors with elaborate solutions, the kind of clever engineering that shows up in Nordic ruins. Finding his corpse would have implied that whatever was in Dampool Mine had already claimed someone who should have been clever enough to survive it. He was designed. His corpse was modeled. His companion bandit was placed beside him. In the final game, Dampool Mine exists and can be explored, but Castor was never placed there, and the story of how a puzzle maker ended up dead in a mine on an island off the coast of Morrowind was never told. Bryling could have been a Jarl. Deep in the voice data for the Civil War quest line, a line of dialogue recorded in the female commander voice type is connected to a character in Solitude, specifically to Thane Bryling, one of Solitude's political figures who, in the final game, remains a Thane but never rises higher. The relevant dialogue and faction link indicate this line was intended for someone wielding significant authority, and based on how this voice type is used elsewhere in the Civil War, the leading interpretation is that a pathway once existed in which Bryling could have become Jarl of Solitude. Elisif's political future is protected by the game's refusal to let her be killed or replaced, but the existence of this authority-level voice data attached to Bryling suggests that at some earlier point in development, the political landscape of Harfingr was more open-ended, more willing to consider a different face on the throne in the Blue Palace under the right conditions. How exactly that pathway would have worked and what would have had to happen to trigger it isn't documented in any surviving quest data. The Whiterun hold, Ulfrid and Vigna scene. A scene between two Whiterun hold characters, Ulfrid Battleborn, the clan patriarch, and Vigna Greymane, the elder of his rival family, was designed to play out as a confrontation about stolen crops, visible to any player who happened to be in the right place when the script triggered. In the final game, the Battleborn and Greymane families are at odds in ways that you can witness in ambient dialogue and optional conversations, but direct confrontational scenes between them are rare. The cutscene would have shown their conflict in action rather than through description. Two old men, heads of rival families, arguing over something as grounded and practical as stolen crops. The political tensions of a hold at war, reduced to the scale of a farm dispute. The scene was set to trigger only before the Siege of Whiterun, correctly reasoned that the argument about crops would make no sense after the city had been fought over. It was a small scene, but small scenes, done well, are often the ones that make a world feel most real. The dark chasm of the Soul Cairn. In the Dawnguard DLC's Soul Cairn, the realm of captured souls and imprisoned vampires where you travel to retrieve a fragment of Elder Scroll, there was supposed to be a small cave called the Dark Chasm. The Soul Cairn is already one of the game's more atmospheric and psychologically affecting environments. A vast grey nothing populated with the shades of people who were soul-trapped and never released. Adding a small, unremarkable cave to it suggests that Bethesda was building the Soul Cairn with the same logic they applied to the main map. Every significant landscape needs its hidden spaces, its caves off the main path, its quiet corners where something might be waiting. The Dark Chasm was added by one restoration mod as exactly what the file suggests it should be. Small, unremarkable, atmospheric. The kind of place you find not because the map points you to it, but because you wandered off the edge of the main path and the darkness simply went somewhere. In the final game, the Soul Cairn has no such space. It is beautifully desolate, but it is also, in this one way, slightly less deep. The Hoarfrost Grotto. Another inaccessible location referenced in the game's data is Hoarfrost Grotto, a small ice cave that appears in restoration mod lists as having been intended to appear in Skyrim's geography. The cave was designed to be home to a frost, Atronach, which positions it as the kind of environmental storytelling location that Skyrim does best. A natural formation inhabited by a creature that belongs there, requiring no quest to explain its presence, requiring only that you open the door and let the cold air out. Ice caves are one of Skyrim's most common and most beautiful environmental types, and the province has dozens of them across its northern and eastern expanses. Hoarfrost Grotto would have been one more. Small, consistent with the world's visual language, a place you find in the course of travelling rather than being sent to. It's Frost Atronach waiting in the dark at the end of a passage you didn't have to enter. Some restoration work has been done to add it back in a location consistent with the game's terrain, adjusting the layout to match Bethesda's existing ice cave standards, adding a necromancer to explain the Atronach's presence. The kind of modest finishing work that the original designers never had time to complete. Mephala wanted to make Balgruuf's children kill him. The Whispering Door is one of Skyrim's darker Daedric quests. You find the Jarl of Whiterun's youngest son whispering to something behind a locked door in the basement, and that something turns out to be Mephala, the Daedric Prince of Secrets and Betrayal. In the final game, only Nelkir is affected, and Balgruuf survives the whole encounter without ever knowing exactly how close his family came to the edge. But the cut version of the quest was something else entirely. Scripts and data preserved in the creation kit show that Mephala was meant to corrupt all 3 of Balgruf's children, one by one. First Nelkir, then Frothar, who was written a scene in which he kills the family's black horse at the stables. A horse named Corinda, a cut NPC who still exists in the files, then Dagny. All 3, gradually, drawn under the Ebony Blade's influence, until a final scene, labelled in the scripts as Children Kill the Jarl, in which all of them gather at an unnamed location and commit patricide. There is even a companion package called Balgruf Wait to Die in Scene, placing the Jarl at the murder site. Upon his death, his brother Hrongar, a character in the final game who exists only as a minor background figure, would have become Jarl, and citizens of Whiterun, including Ulfbert Warbear, have unused dialogue addressing Hrongar by his new title. The Polish localization of Skyrim still contains all the removed dialogue for Nelkir, Frothar, and Dagny's corruption sequences, giving researchers an unusually complete window into what this chapter of the quest was going to feel like. Bethesda removed it. They were probably right to. But the version of Mephala's quest that exists in the files is darker by several orders of magnitude than anything the final game delivers. Eildie the bear and the mill that still gets mentioned. In Falkreath Hold, south of Pinewatch, a lumber mill was supposed to stand, not a ruin, not an abandoned site, but a working operation run by a single resident named Eildie the bear. Eildie was a retired Nord hero, not a generic shopkeeper, but a woman who had earned a name, a title, and enough reputation that Stormcloak guards would have greeted her by saying, "I grew up hearing songs about Eildie the bear. She wrestled a storm out of the sky." Imperial guards, by contrast, would have been considerably less impressed. Bear's Cave Mill was cut from the final game, but both the mill and Eildie are mentioned in the shipped version anyway. Jorn at the Bard's College names her, and guard dialogue in the files is attached to Eildie's voice tracks by what appears to have been a development error, her audio accidentally tagged to Half Moon Mill rather than Bear's Cave Mill. The voice files contain 6 complete greeting lines. She exists in sound but not in the world. A hero whose mill is empty, whose songs are still sung, whose location marker points to open wilderness south of a road you have almost certainly walked. Tassius Tragus, the deleted commander of Dragon Bridge. Dragon Bridge is a small, quiet settlement in Harfingar, notable for its elegant stone arch over the Karth River, and for being a slightly strange place to exist, given how little happens there. Part of that strangeness comes from what's missing. A character named Tassius Tragus was designed as the town's most important figure, an imperial soldier who worked directly for General Tullius, the head of the town's small military presence, the unofficial authority over everything that passed beneath that bridge. In the final game, a resident named Varnius Junius will occasionally say, "Mind you don't cross Tassius, he's in charge around here." And Tassius does not exist. His entire role was transferred to Commander Maro in the final game, but his relationship markers remained. Lover of Fida, secret lover of Julian Lilviv, boss of Varnius Junius, employee of Tullius. A small town with a love triangle baked into its data, pointing to a man who was removed before anyone got to witness any of it. The romance, the authority, the tension between the inn and the road. All of it gone with the NPC, who would have held it together. The Vampire Clan quest line that Dawnguard replaced. Before the Dawnguard DLC introduced the Volkihar Vampire Clan and its enormous quest line. There was a set of vampire-related quests in the base game that never made it to release. 3 quests labeled V01, V02, and V03 in the files would have introduced the player to 2 rival vampire clans native to Skyrim, the Kronvanger and the Quara. The first quest involves stealing an artifact called the Bloodfire Amulet. The second required traveling to Solitude and assassinating a specific NPC named Domna Magia, the same woman who still stands, invisibly disabled, in front of Solitude's Hall of the Dead in the final game. The third quest would have brought the Dragonborn into contact with the leaders of both clans, named Vulkozlak and Neelkar, and the player would have had to choose one to eliminate. These are not vague ideas. Both clan leaders have names, the quest structure was mapped, and the locations referenced in the data are real. Whether Dawnguard grew out of this earlier foundation, or was developed independently alongside it, is something only Bethesda could confirm, but it's worth noting that the Kronvanger and Quara names appear in both the base game cut content and in later DLC adjacent material, which could imply a thread of continuity between these 2 very different vampire storylines. The Falmer Scorpion that guards a trap. In the files of the Dawnguard DLC, specifically among the assets for the Forgotten Vale, the ancient glacial valley where you confront the Snow Elves, is a creature model called DLC, one Falmer Scorpion. The Scorpion was designed to be an ally of the Falmer, guarding the approach to its hole in the ground and attacking you if you stepped too close, functioning as a form of environmental trap. Its mesh and texture files are complete. It was never placed in the world, but here is the detail that makes it genuinely strange. The Scorpion model, the finished creature that never appeared as a live enemy, can still be seen in the final game. The Falmer who inhabit the Forgotten Vale and Darkfall Passage build and decorate their shelters, and their huts and totems contain the Scorpion as an aesthetic object. Dead, decorative, a piece of Falmer iconography. The creature that was supposed to threaten you ended up as furniture. It guards nothing. It attacks no one. It exists in Falmer architecture as a carved or mounted figure, immortalized in the homes of the people it was once supposed to be allied with. Mistmen, the Soulcairn's cut, undead among the Dawnguard. DLC's many unused creatures are a type called Mistmen, undead entities designed to inhabit the Soulcairn, alongside the Mistmen you do encounter in the final game. These unused Mistmen are different from their deployed counterparts. They are armed with leveled weapons drawn from the Draugr inventory. They taunt you with ghostly voices before engaging in combat, and they drop ectoplasm when killed. Their behavioral design suggests a more aggressive, more dangerous version of the Soulcairn's undead population. Creatures that are not simply wandering, but actively hostile, communicative, possessing both speech and weapons. The Soulcairn in the final game is haunting precisely because it feels empty in a particular way, populated by things that have forgotten what they were and move without purpose. Mistmen who taunt you, who carry weapons, who announce their presence before they close in. That would have been a different kind of fear, and it was cut before it could be felt. The pack spider that carries your gear. Added to the files with the Dragonborn DLC were 2 creatures, classified under a type called pack spiders. The first carries gold, and occasionally a gem, a piece of jewelry, or a scroll. The second is larger and more capable of holding heavier loads. Both function, when spawned via console, as containers. You can open them, give them items, take things back. They are companion creatures that carry your equipment, functioning as living storage units in the style of a pack mule. Their existence in the Dragonborn files suggests that at some point during the development of the Solstheim expansion, someone designed a system in which the Dragonborn would have a spider-based companion capable of carrying gear across the ashen landscape. Whether this was meant to be a quest reward, a purchaser bull companion, or simply an atmospheric detail connected to the Dunmeri culture on Solstheim is unclear. What is clear is that the spiders are complete, functional, and interactive, and that the version of Solstheim the player received has no spider, companions, no creature-based pack animals, and no memory that these things were ever planned. The Stormcloak mage who fought in sieges. Among the unused NPCs in Skyrim's files, sitting in the same data as the rest of the Civil War's abandoned combatants, is a character called the Stormcloak mage. He is based on an apprentice Ice Mage template, which is notable because the Stormcloaks in the final game are defined almost entirely by their warrior culture, heavy armor, axes, the blunt physical strength of Nord fighters who view magic with at best polite indifference. The existence of a Stormcloak mage, wearing standard Stormcloak equipment, but carrying a leveled warlock dagger, and belonging to a faction labeled CW Soldier Mage faction, implies that Bethesda once envisioned the Stormcloak army as having magical personnel alongside its foot soldiers. Whether this was a tactical consideration, mages as support in siege battles, or a lore consideration, acknowledging that even nationalist Nords included some practitioners of magic, doesn't change the fact that the final game presents the Stormcloaks without a single soldier who uses spells. The Stormcloak mage stands in the files as a reminder that the Civil War was once designed with more variety on both sides. The drunk cultist at Sanguine's portal, Sanguine's Daedric quest, the one that starts when a stranger named Sam Given challenges you to a drinking contest at a random inn, is one of the game's more comedic side stories. A mystery quest reconstructed backwards from the wreckage of a legendary knight. The quest takes you to a location called Morvunska, where Sanguine's portal to his private realm awaits. In the files, placed at the base of the steps leading to that portal and never enabled, is an unused NPC classified as a drunk cultist. She is a Breton mystic. She is part of the Sanguine cultist faction. She wanders Morvunska when not sleeping. She has no surviving dialogue. Her purpose in the quest is completely unknown. Whether she was meant to be a helpful guide, a hostile guard, an obstacle, a witness, or simply a piece of atmospheric decoration. Someone who had been there since the last time the portal opened and had never quite managed to leave. The files don't say. She is simply there, at the bottom of the stairs, invisible, waiting for a moment that never came. Gorbash's ancestral axe and the quest that became a conversation. In the orc stronghold of Dushnik Yal lives a fighter named Gorbash the Iron Hand, an orc who served in the Imperial Legion and returned to his clan, carrying the particular restlessness of someone who has seen more of the world than he can comfortably forget. In the final game, you can recruit him as a follower with a simple conversation. But the original design was different. Gorbash was meant to give you a quest before he agreed to travel with you, a genuine task with weight behind it. Thieves had stolen his clan's ancestral battle axe years before, and the shame of its loss had followed him from campaign to campaign. He would tell you, "Every night, I sleep fearing that Morlock will curse me for losing it." The axe itself, called Gorbash's ancestral axe, still exists in the game files, placed inside Bergic's longhouse. But it is never enabled, never reachable, a weapon on a shelf in a room you can enter but can never touch. The quest dialogue is preserved but not in the creation kit, only in the raw dialogue views files. Gorbash never gets to ask. The axe never gets returned. The follower who was supposed to earn your company by trusting you with his family's shame simply stands at the training dummy, waiting to be spoken to. The lights out moral choice that was cut. The quest, Lights Out, sends you to extinguish the Solitude Lighthouse's beacon, deliberately wrecking the ship Ice Runner on the rocks to allow a crew of bandits called the Black Blood Marauders to raid it. In the final game, there is no way to avoid the betrayal. Jarira uses you, the ship crashes, and you kill his sister Dija at the wreck. But the cut version of the quest offered a completely different path. You could side with Mazaka, the Khajiit keeper of the Solitude Lighthouse, and work with him and Captain Aldis to stop the Black Blood Marauders instead of assisting them. Aldis would have arrived at the Ice Runner's wreck to help fight them off, and Dija would have had the option to surrender, entering a bleed-out state, yielding and potentially being arrested rather than killed. The dialogue for this sequence was recorded but attached to the wrong character's voice type, making it unrecoverable without significant rework. The cut version of Lights Out is one of the cleanest examples of a moral choice being removed entirely. The game's ethics simplified from a fork in the road into a straight line. The lighthouse keeper, who could have been your ally standing in his tower in the final game with no particular story to tell. Tolfdir's Lost Book, the quest in which Tolfdir the absent-minded loses his alembic and asks you to find it, is one of Skyrim's gentler moments. A small errand for a forgetful old mage. The college's humanity distilled into a single missing piece of lab equipment. What the files reveal is that this quest may have been slightly more involved. According to the TCRF's analysis of leftover dialogue topics, there are 2 topics in the quest that have no response from Tolfdir. Loose conversation threads that were never connected to anything. Based on this, and the quest's internal structure, it seems plausible that Tolfdir was also meant to have lost a book alongside the alembic. The details of which book, what it contained, and where it was found are entirely absent from the data. So this reading is inference rather than certainty. But the image it suggests, Tolfdir simultaneously losing 2 things, wandering the college in a state of dispersed concern, misplacing his research across multiple rooms and hallways, is a funnier and more endearing version of a character who is already one of the game's most quietly affectionate portraits of academic life. Captain Lonely Gale's missing authority. In Windhelm, a character named Captain Lonely Gale exists in the final game as a somewhat aimless figure, a Nord who wanders the docks and exchanges occasional pleasantries. But the data surrounding him suggests he was once significantly more important. He was meant to serve as Ulfric Stormcloak's guard captain, operating within the chain of military command that theoretically governed Windhelm's security. Multiple leftover elements confirm this: relationship markers, internal references, faction assignments. But because none of them are externally visible, the role never materialized in gameplay. The detail that makes this most poignant is a scene between 2 Windhelm characters. Belin Hlalu, a dark elf farmer who works the land outside the city, will sometimes speak to his farmhand Adizla about Lonely Gale, treating him as though he was still the guard captain. The conversation exists in the final game. It refers to a role he was stripped of, in a city where the authority structure matters, where the Stormcloaks hold power and their chain of command defines the treatment of the city's dark elf population. the erasure of the guard captain position from the visible world, while leaving his name in ambient conversation, is an oddly quiet piece of missing context. The spirit of the ancient traveller. At Wayward Pass, a treacherous mountain route in Skyrim's northeastern highlands, there is a skull. The skull belongs to someone called the spirit of the ancient traveller, an NPC who exists in the game's files with a full slate of steel plate armor and a steel sword, but who in the final game is disabled and never appears in the world. The design was simple. If you picked up the skull, the spirit would be summoned, rising from wherever travelers' souls collect in the cold passes of Skyrim, prepared to fight you. The equipment he was given, steel plate, which is mid-tier armor in the final game, suggests a significant but manageable encounter. The kind of optional fight you would stumble into while crossing from one part of the world to another. The skull is there in the final game. The pass is there. The game data says the spirit should spawn when someone picks it up, but he never does, because his reference was never enabled, and the skull at Wayward Pass sits there like a forgotten trigger, waiting for a ghostly encounter that never comes to those who find it. Tarek, the man who lived in your house. When the Dragonborn first purchases Breeze Home in Whiterun, the small, affordable first home available in the game, the property is empty, waiting to be furnished. But in the files, a character named Tarek had been designed to live inside that house, illegally. He is an Imperial citizen wearing farmer clothes, carrying an iron dagger, belonging to the Breeze Home faction. He is the only member of the Breeze Home faction. A burial urn for him exists in Whiterun's Hall of the Dead, already prepared, as if the city anticipated the possibility of his death. He is not a quest target. He has no connection to any scripted event. He would simply have been there, squatting in the house you paid for, with a unique dialogue line. Now I don't care about no deeds or laws or other nonsense like that. That implies exactly what kind of person he is. The idea that Breeze Home, Skyrim's most accessible player home, was at some point imagined as occupied by an unapologetic squatter with a burial urn already prepared in the city graveyard is both extremely funny and weirdly atmospheric. Sulver and the Cut Wheelhouse location. Windhelm is full of narrow streets, stone buildings, and characters who have been living in close proximity for too long. A cut location called the Wheelhouse was designed for the city, and an elderly Nord named Sulvar was assigned to live inside it. Sulvar wears a belted tunic, a hat, and carries an iron dagger. He is still part of Eastmarch's crime faction and Windhelm's faction, fully embedded in the city's internal systems, waiting for a building that never existed in the final game. The Wheelhouse, what it was, what function it served, whether it was a social space or a private home or a business, is unclear from the data. The name suggests something mechanical, something industrial, the kind of place a cold northern city would need for the maintenance of something large and heavy. Sulvar's age and his placement in the Windhelm faction suggest he would have been a permanent fixture of the place. Not a visitor, but a resident of long standing, someone the city had grown around. The three-cut Mercer Frey guards. Mercer Frey's townhouse in Riften is one of the more atmospheric locations in the Thieves' Guild questline. A wealthy thief's private residence, full of evidence of exactly who he is if you know what to look for. In the final game, when you investigate the house during the quest The Pursuit, you find bandits serving as placeholder guards, a detail that has always looked slightly rough around the edges. That's because it wasn't intentional. 3 named guards were designed for the house, Skegger, Hrolmir, and Reeves. Skegger was to replace one bandit, Hrolmir the wizard in the basement, and Reeves a third placeholder. None of them were implemented. They are listed in the files with editor IDs and faction assignments, fully designed as Mercer's personal security, and simply never placed in the world before the game shipped. Their absence means the basement of Mercer's house is defended by enemies who don't belong there, bandits. With no particular reason to be inside a Thieves Guild leader's private property, standing in for guards whose names were already chosen. Ayla's Cut Animal Pelt Quest. The Companions faction has a handful of Radiant quests that keep it feeling alive after the main storyline ends. Radiant bounty contracts, requests for companions to follow you, errands from the inner circle. But one Radiant quest never made it to the shipped game. Ayla the Huntress was meant to occasionally send you out to gather animal pelts for her. A random number between 3 and 7, drawn from whatever creatures you found in the wilderness. The quest is designed with unfinished journal entries and incomplete logic, suggesting it was cut during a phase when Radiant quests were still being assembled rather than after they had been polished. The cutting room floor mod restores it, giving Ayla a small ongoing use that suits her character precisely. She is a hunter, she respects the hunt, and asking you to bring her the products of a hunt is exactly the kind of errand she would run. In the final game, she asks you to go places and do things that don't quite have that quality. The Pelt Collection quest, small as it is, would have given the Companions faction a texture it currently lacks. Runil's confession and the secret he carries. More can be said about Runil's Dark Past quest than the basic premise, because the cut dialogue reveals exactly how the story was meant to unfold. You would not have spoken to Runil first. You would have heard about his trouble from one of his friends, someone in Falkreath who knew something was wrong without fully knowing what. Armed with that fragmented knowledge, you'd approach Runil, and then you'd have a choice. Keep his secret, or tell Kust the Gravekeeper, Matthias the Farmer, or Indara Karelia, 3 named Falkreath residents who were all written specific responses to hearing whatever Runil had done. 4 different characters were given dialogue for the outcome. The quest reaches into Falkreath's community in a way that the final game almost never does, treating the small hold capital not as a backdrop for quests that happen elsewhere, but as a place with its own history and its own weight. Runil still carries his secret in the final game. The people who might have heard it have conversations about other things entirely, and no one in Falkreath ever quite has the conversation Bethesda once wrote for them. The healing encounter that left no trace. Among the wilderness encounters listed in the development files is one referred to as WE30, a world interaction that would have involved the Dragonborn encountering an injured NPC in a bleed-out state, kneeling on the road, in distress. The interaction was built around a healing mechanic. You could approach the fallen traveller and restore their health, and something would follow from that act of mercy. What followed exactly is unknown. The script that defined the encounter's conclusion didn't survive, and there is nothing remaining at all, as the cutting room floor archive notes. But the beginning of the encounter is clear enough. An injured person on the road, and a choice about whether to stop. In a game where the roads of Skyrim are full of bandits, wolves, and Imperial scouts, where stumbling across the aftermath of violence is common, but stumbling across someone actively dying is rarer. This encounter would have created a moment of pure moral weight without any quest marker attached to it. It existed, it had logic, and its ending simply didn't make it to the archive. The Stormcloak Courier's missing horse. Among the data files for the Civil War quest, A False Front, the one in which you intercept an enemy courier carrying false battle plans, is a marker with the editor I, DCWW, Courier Horse Marker Heljarchen. This marker was supposed to give the Stormcloak courier a horse to ride on as they travelled between the cut village of Heljarchen and their destination. It is one of at least 11 such horse markers spread across Skyrim's various cut settlements, each one designed to give couriers mounts for their routes. In the final game, couriers travel on foot, sometimes jogging, sometimes walking, arriving at their destinations at whatever pace a running human achieves. The horse markers suggest a Skyrim where fast travel felt embedded in the world, rather than abstracted from it, where you might pass a courier on horseback, where the urgency of wartime dispatches would have been visible in the speed at which they moved. The couriers still run their errands in the final game. They just do it at human pace, on roads that were once designed to accommodate something faster. Darkwater Crossing and its missing fishermen. Darkwater Crossing is a small mining community near the Rift, notable in the final game for being where the Dragonborn is captured by Imperial soldiers in the opening sequence, at least according to the dialogue, which still reflects an earlier version of the game where the ambush happened there rather than at the Cyrodiil border. But the settlement's cut content goes beyond the opening scene. A quest stage for the miscellaneous task of rescuing the Argonian Dirkethus, who has been captured by Fulmer in a nearby cave, refers to him as one of the fishermen from Darkwater Crossing. The way it's worded implies plural fishermen, and indeed, two of the settlement's characters, Tormir and Sonders, have dialogue that references fish and fishing in their descriptions of local life. The fishing markers that appear in cut content documentation point to planned activity the settlement never received. Darkwater Crossing, as shipped, is a mining camp, but the data suggests it was once also meant to be a fishing community. The river running past its workers' huts, serving not just as scenery, but as a source of food and livelihood that was quietly removed when the settlement was scaled back. Grushnag and the Khajiit Caravan Guard. Travelling with the Khajiit merchant caravans of Skyrim in the final game involves encountering the same handful of merchants and camp followers who rotate between cities. But an unused orc named Grushnag was designed specifically to travel with the Markarth Khajiit caravan as a guard. He wears scaled horn armour, scaled boots, and scaled bracers, equipment that marks him as a capable fighter rather than a trader. His purpose was practical. The road between the Reach's major settlements is one of the most dangerous in Skyrim, regularly contested by forsworn raiders, and a heavily armoured orc guard alongside the caravan would have communicated something specific about how dangerous that road was and how seriously the merchants took that danger. Grushnag's presence would have been a small piece of world building, evidence that the world outside the player's quests has stakes, that the people travelling it are paying attention to its risks. He is still part of the Khajiit caravan faction data. He simply never appears at the gates of Markarth or on the road beside it. The Whiterun Pathway Guard Tower, in the data files for Whiterun Hold, is a reference to a location called Pathway Guard Tower, a structure that would have stood somewhere along the approaches to the city, serving as a forward observation post or defensive position for Whiterun's guards. No complete data survives about its physical layout, its occupants, or the quests it might have supported. Only the location reference remains, a name pointing to a place that was planned during the design of the hold and removed before it was built. Guard towers as environmental features already exist at various points in Skyrim's landscape. Fort Greymore, the small outposts along the roads, and a dedicated tower along Whiterun's approach would have fit naturally into the province's visual grammar. But it was cut, and the road to Whiterun remains open, unguarded by the structure that was once meant to watch over it from whatever hill it was supposed to occupy. Tolfdir is called Tolfdir the White. In the internal editor references for the creation kit, the College of Winterhold's most beloved professor has an alternate name. His reference ID calls him Tolfdir the White, a title that would have given him the kind of grand, law-weighted designation reserved for figures of real significance. In the Elder Scrolls world, titles like that carry histories behind them. Tolfdir, in the final game, is a man defined by his kindness, his patience, and his absent-mindedness. A good teacher, an encouraging presence, a mage whose power is implied more than demonstrated. Tolfdir the White suggests a version of the character who had a past, who earned something, who carries a name that means something specific in the history of Winterhold or the study of magic. Whether that name was a placeholder, a joke, an early version of the character that was softened, or a genuine title that was removed to keep his characterization gentle and grounded, the files don't say. It simply lingers in the data, a title attached to a man who, in the world you can actually visit, goes by one name and misplaces his alembic. Samgavenna's alternate name. Along similar lines, the wandering stranger who initiates Sanguine's Daedric quest has an internal reference that calls him Dio16 Samwell, a name that was apparently changed late enough in development that the editor reference was never updated to reflect it. Samgavenna is the name he uses in the final game, a pleasantly alliterative, slightly theatrical alias for a Daedric prince who enjoys disguises and chaos. Samwell is simpler, more grounded, the kind of name a travelling Nord farmer might actually have. The shift from Samwell to Gaven suggests a late decision to lean harder into the character's theatrical quality. The Prince of Revelry presenting himself not as an ordinary traveller, but as someone with exactly the kind of name you might invent if you were a god, playing at being human. The internal reference to Samwell is a tiny window into the moment before that decision was made, when Sanguine was still wearing a name that fit more quietly into a world of everyday strangers. The Herebane Sorenshield secret, in Dawnguard's Kilcreath ruins, the dungeon associated with the quest The Break of Dawn, and the Daedric artifact Dawnbreaker. There is a stretch between the first and second interior areas, where a named imperial figure named Herebane Sorenshield was designed to appear. He would patrol this stretch, serving as a mid-dungeon encounter with a named face, rather than a generic Volkihar vampire. He carries two unique items: Hairbane's Courage, an elven sword that deals fire damage, and Hairbane's Fortress, an elven shield that boosts frost resistance. A thematic pairing that suggests a warrior defined by the tension between heat and cold. In the final game, the dungeon exists, the stretch between the two interior areas exists, and their items exist in the data. But they can only be found on Herebane's body if the cutting room floor mod restores him to his intended location. Without the mod, both items are completely unobtainable through any normal means, sitting in a test cell alongside other developer-facing assets, named after someone who never made it into the world. It is one of the cleaner examples in Skyrim's cut content, where the gap is invisible unless you know where to look. The Research Thief quest and Feralda's notes. The cut College of Winterhold quest, in which Nyria asks you to steal Feralda's research notes, was, according to its internal classification, a repeatable Radiant quest. This means it wasn't a one-time story. It was meant to be an ongoing feature of college life, a recurring opportunity to engage with the political dynamics of an institution full of competitive majors. Each time it triggered, the stakes and the research in question might have been different, though the basics structure would have remained. Neria wants information, Faralda has it, and you're the one being asked to move something from one woman's possession to the other. The quest was left in an unfinished state but functional enough that restoration mods can activate it. Players who encounter it describe the dynamic between Neria and Faralda as one of the college's more convincing interpersonal tensions. Two skilled mages on the same faculty who clearly do not get along, whose rivalry the final game hints at but never gives room to develop. The repeatable version would have made that tension feel like a living feature of the college rather than background texture. Zarya and the mill she used to work at. In Falkreath, the town's apothecary merchant is a woman named Zarya. She runs her shop, sells her potions, and doesn't say much about her past. But the dialogue files contain scenes she was meant to have that reveal a completely different history. In one cutscene, Zarya is working at the local mill, not the apothecary, the sawmill, suggesting that she had a different occupation at some point in the development of Falkreath's cast of characters. In a second cutscene, the innkeeper, Valga Venetia, refers to Zarya as a war veteran. Neither of these facts exist anywhere in the final game. The Zarya of the shipped version is a merchant with no history, a face behind a counter, performing the function the game requires of her. The Zarya that the files describe is a veteran who once worked a mill and now runs a potions shop. Someone whose presence in Falkreath is not incidental but earned, the product of a life that moved through the hold in stages. That version of her never made it to the fire. The Falkreath graveyard scenes. Falkreath's graveyard is the largest in all of Skyrim, a fact that locals mention with the kind of dark civic pride reserved for things you can't change, and have decided to embrace. The graveyard has stories. The small grave of Lavinia, the priest Runal attending funerals, travellers stopping to reflect on the bones beneath the town's most prominent feature. But a set of scenes designed to play out among the grave markers was cut from the final game. Multiple Falkreath townsfolk were written with AI packages designed to bring them to the graveyard for specific interactions, scenes between characters that would have played out like the quiet moments that small communities have in places set aside for contemplation. The scenes were removed at some point during development, and the graveyard that remains is beautiful and atmospheric, but functionally inert. A setting without the encounters that would have given it the texture of a place where the living still come to be near the dead. Fort Blackmoor and the renamed fortress. In the data for Skyrim's geography, a number of locations have internal editor references that use older names from early in development that were changed before the game shipped. Fort Greymoor, a bandit stronghold west of Whiterun on the road to Markarth, is referred to internally as Fort Blackmoor. The latter name appears to be a direct reference to Blackmoor, a village that appeared in the Elder Scrolls. Arena, as a holding in Skyrim, roughly at the same location. The rename from Blackmoor to Greymoor is a single shade lighter, a decision that could be entirely aesthetic or could reflect a change in what the location was supposed to represent. More significantly, Blackmoor as a village name carries historical weight in the Elder Scrolls world. A settlement that existed in the game's earliest era, referenced in ancient maps, now converted into a generic bandit fortress bearing a name that gestures toward its origin without quite acknowledging it. Xander's shopping trip. Among Solitude's many named residents is a sailor named Xander, who serves on the Red Wave, a ship docked in Solitude's harbour. In the final game, Xander is one of a handful of sailors whose main purpose is to exist near the ship and say a few lines, if addressed. But the cut dialogue files reveal 3 scripted scenes in which he travels up from the docks into the city itself, visiting specific shops and conducting his personal business like a man with places to be and things to buy. The scenes were cut, and Xander remains on the docks, confined to the harbour level of a city he was once supposed to walk freely. The cutting room floor mod restores his shopping trips, and players who see them describe the experience of watching a minor character navigate Solitude's winding streets as one of the mod's more satisfying small details. Not dramatic, not consequential, just a sailor going to buy something before his ship leaves, doing what people do in cities when they have a few hours ashore. The small bird inside the wall, in the data for Snapleg Cave, one of Skyrim's many hag-infested dungeons, home to spriggans and hag ravens. There is a small bird, classified as a movable static, the game's term for an object that can be interacted with physically, but doesn't have creature behavior. It is embedded in one of the cave's stone walls. Its official file name simply describes it as small bird. It has no quest connection, no dialogue, no clear purpose that can be determined from the surrounding data. It is simply a small bird, inside a stone wall, in a hagraven's cave. Whether it was a decorative asset placed accidentally in the wrong position, a piece of environmental storytelling about what hagravens do to the creatures they encounter, a test object left from a development session and never removed, or something else entirely, is completely unknown. It is one of the most quietly mysterious things in Skyrim's unused content precisely because it has no narrative framework around it at all. Just a bird in a wall, in a dark cave, waiting in a spot no developer apparently ever came back to explain. Fallout remnants in Skyrim's data. In the files of the Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, buried in the creation kit's data, alongside dragons and Nordic ruins and Civil War scripts, are several remnants of Bethesda's other major franchise. Blank, functional versions of Fallout systems exist in Skyrim's code. The Pip-Boy interface, the VATS targeting system, and a hacking terminal mechanic. They have no implementations. They do nothing. They are, as the cutting room floor archive describes them, completely blank. Whether these are artifacts of Bethesda working across both code bases simultaneously and accidentally carrying data between them, or placeholder systems from a very early phase of development when the engine that would eventually power Skyrim was still being adapted from older work, is unclear. There is also a remnant of Fallout 3's Chinese officer's sword, calling for textures that no longer exist in Skyrim's files, and a remnant of Fallout 3's baseball bat in the same condition. Bethesda's games have always shared development infrastructure, but the presence of these objects in the final shipping data of a fantasy RPG set in a frozen Nordic province is exactly the kind of detail that makes the archaeology of a game's development files feel strangely intimate. The residue of how studios actually work, long after the product has been polished clean. An unused archery perk that works. In the archery skill tree in Skyrim's creation kit is an unused perk that never appears in the game's skill menu. A perk that, at 80 archery skill and after unlocking quickshot, would grant a 25% chance of disarming an opponent with each arrow. The perk has a complete description. It has a position in the tree. It simply isn't visible in the tree as shipped, and it works. players who add it via console commands confirm that the disarm effect triggers and functions exactly as described. Someone implemented this perk fully, tested it, and it was not included in the game for reasons that are entirely unknown. The archery tree in the final game already has disarm as a perk accessible through the speech tree in certain combat contexts, so perhaps the redundancy was the issue. Or perhaps the perk was cut during a late pass that reduced the skill trees to a more manageable number of options. Either way, the perk sits in the data, unnamed in any menu, functional in any test, waiting to be discovered by players who know the console commands and want an archery build that doesn't yet officially exist. The Conjuration perk, based on Konarik's Mask, also unused in Skyrim's Conjuration skill tree, is a standalone spell or perk based on the enchantment of Konarik's Mask, one of the Dragon Priest masks, the one that can trigger a healing effect when the wearer's health runs low. The unused Conjuration content takes that enchantment and frames it as something a mage could learn and apply independently of the mask, a spellcasting version of a passive item effect. In the final game, that power exists only in one specific artifact, tied to a specific questline and a specific playstyle. The unused version would have made it available to any Conjuration specialist who invested far enough in the skill tree, democratizing a defensive mechanic that in the final game is locked behind one of the game's most challenging item sets. Whether it was cut for balance reasons or simply left incomplete, the standalone version of that enchantment never appears in any menu, in any trainer's inventory, or in any chest in Skyrim's world. The NPC with a Fallout 3 sword. While the Fallout system remnants in Skyrim's files are curiosities of engine archaeology, the item remnant that comes with an NPC context is more unsettling. Somewhere in the creation kit, a model exists that calls for the textures of Fallout 3's Chinese officer's sword. A weapon that has no place in the Elder Scrolls world, no design that fits Nordic or Imperial or Elven aesthetics, no lore connection to anything in the province of Skyrim. The sword isn't fully functional in Skyrim's context because the textures it needs no longer exist in the file system. It would appear as a corrupted or untextured object if placed. But the mesh remains, and the call for its textures remains, and the item record that generated it at some point in development is still sitting in the data of a game about dragonborns and Daedra and dragon shouts. It is the kind of detail that suggests not careful curation, but something messier and more human. Two projects worked on in overlapping offices, assets shared across folders that weren't always clearly labeled, someone building toward one game while still thinking about another. The Civil War's unwritten aftermath. In the aftermath of a Stormcloak victory in the Civil War, Jarl Ulfric Stormcloak becomes the High King of Skyrim in all but formal title. The final game's epilogue is brief and somewhat unsatisfying, gesturing at political change without fully depicting it. But in the dialogue files, there are remnants of additional lines and correspondence, unused content that was meant to accompany the political transitions following the war's conclusion. Beyond the single declaration that cutting room floor restores, the files suggest that a longer ending was once written. The full scope of what was planned, the conversations between characters adjusting to a different Skyrim, the new political arrangements, exists in fragments that restoration modders have been cataloguing for years. Whether these fragments constituted a fully designed extended epilogue or simply early draft lines that were later trimmed is difficult to say from the data alone. What seems clear is that the Civil War ending a ship feels compressed, and the files hold enough leftover material to suggest that whoever wrote it had more to say. Fatendas and Felici. Heljarchen's last ghosts. Of the 6 NPCs designed for the village of Heljarchen, 2 survive in the most minimal possible way. Fatendas exists in the game only as a key, a data object that implies a house, an owner, and a door that once belonged to them. The naming convention suggests they might have been a Bosmer, a Breton, or possibly a Dunmer, and the key is tagged as belonging to either the blacksmith store or the apothecary that were planned for the village. Felici exists only as a fishing marker, a point in the world where, had Heljarchen been built, she would have stood to fish, presumably in the body of water near where the village was planned. Her name suggests a female Dunmer. Neither character has any data beyond these traces. They are defined entirely by an object and a behavior that have no world around them, a key to a house that was never placed, and a fishing spot in a village that was never built. Of all the cut content in Skyrim, Fatendas and Felici may be the most thoroughly reduced to pure intention. They exist in the game's files as the barest possible evidence that someone once intended for them to exist in the world. Barleydark Farm and the Whiterun Cut, alongside Maiden Loom Manor and the Pathway Guard Tower. A location called Barleydark Farm was planned for Whiterun Hold. The name implies a working agricultural property, a dark grain farm, the kind of modest operation that would supply Whiterun's market stalls with bread grain and have its own quiet story about the people who worked it. The farm exists in the files as a location reference, with no physical realization, no NPCs placed on it, no quest tied to it. Barleydark is one of a handful of planned agricultural locations across Skyrim's holds that suggest the game was once designed with a more complete economy. Farms that supplied specific markets, mills connected to specific villages, an ecology of food production that connected settlements to one another in ways the final game only gestures at. The road through Whiterun Hold passes whatever empty hillside Barleydark was meant to occupy, and the tundra extends unmarked to the horizon beyond it. Farfolk Mansion in Falkreath Hold. Among the cut locations documented in Skyrim's data files is a structure called Farfolk Mansion, associated with Falkreath Hold. The name is distinct, not a farm, not a mill, not a cave, but a manor house, the kind of property that implies wealth and history and the particular kind of isolation that wealthy people sometimes choose in places like Falkreath, where the forest is close and the graveyard is prominent, and the atmosphere lends itself to gothic drama. No complete data survives about what Farfolk Mansion would have contained, or who would have owned it. It exists as a name in a location list, pointing to a building that was planned for a hold already defined by its relationship with death and memory. Falkreath's existing locations: the Hall of the Dead, the graveyard, the Half Moon Mill with its vampiric innkeepers, suggests that a mansion in the hold would have had something genuinely interesting behind its door. Whatever it was, it didn't make it to the world you can walk through. The skooma quest at Anger's Mill. In the data files, a cut quest called Freeform Anger's Mill Cordir Skooma suggests a storyline at Anger's Mill, the lumber operation in the Pale, involving a character named Cordir and skooma. The quest has no surviving dialogue. It is known only from its editor ID, but its name implies a story about addiction or trade, or the intersection of a working-class logging community with one of Skyrim's most persistent social problems. Skooma runs through the game's background as a social fact. There are users in Riften's Ratway. There are coded references to its trade, there are characters who struggle with it in dialogue that goes nowhere. A quest specifically attached to a named character at a named mill would have given that background social detail a human face and a local address. Corder, whoever he was, had a connection to Skooma that was important enough to build a quest around. And then that quest, like Corder himself, was removed, and Anger's mill runs its saws and supplies its lumber, without any particular story attached to the people doing the work. Wintersen Manor. One more Whiterun Hold location. Wintersen Manor appears in the cut content location list, alongside Barley Dark Farm and the Pathway Guard Tower, another building designed for the Hold that was never realized in the final world. A manor in the Whiterun area would have been consistent with the kind of established Nord noble or wealthy landowner that the Hold's history implies. Whiterun is Skyrim's centre of trade and political moderation, and the presence of a well-maintained private manor in the Hold would have reflected its relative stability. What the manor contained, what its story was, and who would have lived there is unknown. It is another name on a list of places that were imagined and then removed, leaving Whiterun Hold slightly more empty than it was once planned to be. The tundra between the city and the mountains slightly more unoccupied than the people who designed it intended. The NPC called Do Not Delete Me. In the data files added by the Dragonborn DLC, there is an unused Nord NPC who has no location in the world and bears the name Do Not Delete Me, needed for export to work. She appears visually identical to Freya, the Skull Shaman, who accompanies the player through Apocrypha. She carries nothing. She has no quests, no dialogue, no faction. Her name is a development instruction accidentally preserved in a character data field. A note from one developer to another, warning them not to delete a placeholder NPC that was apparently necessary for some step of the DLC's export process. In shipping the game, no one removed her. She exists in Dragonborn's data with her imperative name intact, a human-shaped reminder that games are made by people under deadline, that placeholder systems accumulate their own kind of archaeology, and that sometimes the most interesting thing in a game's files is not a quest or a weapon or a village, but simply a note that says, "Please don't delete this," in a context where no one, apparently, ever thought to. The Ice Runner's arrested alternative. The cut version of Lights Out had one detail worth dwelling on. In the alternate path, where you sided with Mazaka and Captain Aldis, Dija, the Argonian bandit, who serves as one of the quest's primary antagonists in the final game, would not necessarily have died. She could have been arrested. She would have entered a bleed-out state, a combat surrender, and from there you would have had a choice: finish her or let the guards take her. Captain Aldis would have reacted to your decision differently depending on what you chose. Dija herself had unique dialogue for this moment that has since been entirely lost from the files. In the final game, Dija dies. Every time. There is no option. The cut version was one of Skyrim's more morally granular moments, a named antagonist who could be brought to justice rather than simply killed, a guard captain whose opinion of you changed based on how you handled a surrendered prisoner. That moment was cut when the whole alternate path was removed, and Dija has been dying in the same spot on the same ship's deck in every playthrough for every player since the game shipped in 2011. Darkwater Crossing and the battle that moved. In the final game, the opening sequence shows the Dragonborn being captured by Imperial soldiers on the road to Cyrodiil, near the province's southern border. But internal data from the game's development points toward a different origin. Darkwater Crossing, the small mining community in the Rift, has location data containing markers and references tied to Civil War capture events, markers that weren't connected to the final. Opening sequence. Based on what survives in the files, the leading interpretation among researchers is that the opening ambush was originally intended to take place there, rather than at the Cyrodiil border. An opening set in a populated settlement with miners and riverside geography would have been a very different kind of beginning than the road in the snow. Characters in the final game who live at Darkwater Crossing have no dialogue, acknowledging that the Dragonborn story might have started there. The community itself is slightly disconnected from the events of the main questline, which could imply it was once more central to the story's opening. Though how much of that disconnection is intentional design, and how much is residue from a changed plan, isn't entirely clear from the data alone. The Barbas dialogue that was cut. Barbas, the shape-shifting dog who serves as a companion during the Daedric quest, Clavicus Vile's a Daedra's best friend, has unused dialogue that was removed before the game shipped. The re-enabled version, restored by some content mods, includes additional conversational lines that Barbas would have delivered while traveling with the player. Lines that expand on his personality, his relationship with Clavicus Vile, and his perspective on the events of the quest. Barbas is already one of the game's more entertaining companions for the brief window you travel with him. His commentary on the world filtered through the particular weariness of a divine entity who has been living as a dog for longer than he cares to remember. The cut lines would have extended that quality. More observations, more dryness, more of the exhausted affection that defines his attitude toward a master he loves and a situation he finds genuinely undignified. Some of the cut lines are accessible via the re-enabled dialogue options that Cutting Room Floor restores, and players who experience them consistently describe Barbas's expanded commentary as one of the mod's most welcome additions. Syncope Sanctuary's lost identity. In the list of cut locations documented in Skyrim's files is a place called Syncope Sanctuary, a name that carries strong Daedric associations, syncope being a word related to altered states of consciousness, the kind of terminology that appears in Sanguine's questline, or in the dream logic spaces of certain Daedric realms. The sanctuary has no surviving data beyond its name and location reference. Whether it was connected to the Sanguine questline, the Vampire Clan storyline, or something else entirely is impossible to determine. But the name alone communicates something. This was not a Nord ruin or a bandit camp or a fishing hole. This was a sacred space, a place of refuge or ritual, something designed to occupy the stranger edges of the world where the line between Nirn and oblivion gets thin. It appears in the same reference lists that contain Stormcaller Cave and other locations that the modders who worked on the Vampire Clan restoration recognized from the base game's cut content. Whatever it was planned for a part of Skyrim's world that the final game barely touched. Argi Farsa's 3 AM walk, Argi Farsa, Idgrod Ravencrone's mystically inclined sister, was not only designed for the village of Stonehills. She had a full daily schedule, and that schedule contains one of the most quietly evocative details in all of Skyrim's unused NPC data. She would sleep at 11 in the evening. She would wake at 10 in the morning. But there is a less than 20% chance that she would interrupt her sleep at 3 in the morning for a 3-hour stroll around Stonehills before returning to her bed. 3 in the morning, for 3 hours. The game doesn't explain why, and the data doesn't say. It simply marks the probability and the duration, leaving the reason entirely to interpretation. a mystic woman, sister to a visionary Jarl, walking circuits of a small mining village in the dead of night for reasons that are not recorded. Whether she was chasing a vision, processing something she had seen, performing some midnight ritual, or simply unable to sleep is entirely and intentionally unstated. It is one of the strangest and most atmospheric pieces of character design in any NPC that never appeared in the final game. The soldiers who sanded the roads, the carriage horse markers described earlier, are not the only evidence that Skyrim's roads were once designed to feel more lived in and contested than they ended up. In the Civil War's data files, which a developer left a note describing as full of obsolete stuff from previous iterations where it was more dynamic and free form, there are references to patrols, checkpoints and road interactions that were never implemented in the final system. The Civil War as shipped is largely static. Your allegiance determines which soldiers are friendly and which are hostile, and you encounter them at fixed camps. But the development files describe a more organic system in which the roads between holds were genuinely watched, where soldiers moved between posts, where the political situation of each hold was expressed not just in which Jarl sat in a keep, but in what you encountered on the roads between cities. All of that dynamism, the roads as contested spaces, the soldiers as moving parts of a living conflict, collapsed during development into the version you know, where the war is real but the roads are largely quiet. The Khajiit caravan horses, in a detail that connects to both the unused caravan guard Grushnag and the broader question of how Skyrim's roads once felt. The Khajiit caravans that travel between the major cities of Skyrim in the final game have no horses. They walk. The merchants and their followers travel at foot speed between Whiterun and Markarth and Riften and the other hold capitals, arriving on schedule in a way that is slightly magical if you think about the distances involved. But in the data files documented by restoration modders, there are unused horse assignments for several Khajiit caravan members, not just implied by a general system, but specifically tagged to individual caravan participants. Some restoration work has placed horses with the Khajiit caravans, and the effect players report is significant. The caravans feel like commercial operations, the horses loaded with goods, the whole enterprise suggesting a real economy of travel and trade rather than the slightly placeless quality the final caravans have when you realize they simply appear at city gates and wait.